Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will come to order. The committee meets today to consider legislation to amend Title V, United States Code, to comply with the reconciliation directive included in Section 201 of the concurrent resolution on the budget for FY 2013. H.R. 2008, the Keeping Politics Out of Federal Contracting Act of 2011. H.R. 4078, the Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act of 2012. H.R. 4607, the Midnight Rule Relief Act of 2012. H.R. 3609, the Taxpayers' Right to Know Act, and Senate 1302, to authorize the Administrator of General Services to convey a parcel of property in Tracy, California, to the City of Tracy. The committee will now consider legislation to amend Title V, the United States Code, to comply with the reconciliation directive included in Section 201 of the concurrent resolution on the budget for FY 2013, and I recognize myself for a quick opening statement. The House-passed budget resolution contains reconciliation instructions requiring this committee to transmit to the Budget Panel policies producing savings of $80 billion over 10 years. All of the members of the committee know this committee has essentially one source of possible mandatory savings: Federal employee retirement benefits, and thus very much limits our options to comply with the House's instructions. Under the Congressional Budget Act, the Committee on Budget will be empowered to write their own bill if this committee fails to meet this obligation under the Budget Act. I hope that members on both sides recognize it is better for us to pick and choose how to comply with the budget resolution than simply leave a committee less familiar with the Federal workforce and less dedicated to ensure that those changes made have the minimum negative impact on current and future employees, and particularly on current and near-term retirees. Achieving the mandatory savings within our jurisdiction requires reform of the Federal pension system, which is arguably more generous than those available to the average private sector worker. As members on both sides of the aisle know, the vast majority of private sector workers do not have a defined benefits plan. More and more 401s equivalent to our TSP are the rule. Today, we will primarily concern ourselves with the retirement system, which will be referred to as FERS, where we, as Federal employees, contribute less than 1% of our pay toward this defined benefit annuity. The taxpayer contributes 16 times as much to to workers' pension. So one part worker contribution, 16-part taxpayer contribution. The language before the committee increases the employee or fair share contribution by 5% of salary over 5 years. Members of Congress will see their contribution increase additionally to 8.5% over the same period. When these policies are phased in, Federal employees and members of Congress will both be paying approximately 50% of the normal cost of their pension, meaning this pension will still be, by private sector standards, majority simply because, or generous only because it exists. It will, however, be much more commensurate with some union and most non-union pensions. Many will argue, and I would be one of them, that the State of California has a far more generous pension plan. But the State of California, my home State, is in financial crisis. It has run itself into bankruptcy, and in fact, its pension is looming to create insolvency within my State. Today, we are considering within the budget FY 2013 resolutions what we can in the best way we can. Let's make it perfectly clear. Reductions in the Federal pension are not intended to in any way reflect on the hard-working men and women of the Federal workforce. Budgetary cuts in this fiscal year are a result of a need to reduce the budget by a sufficient amount not to have to limit ourselves through sequestration, our national defense, and other essential services. So for those who would take this as an opportunity to speak ill of the Federal workforce or to claim that the contract they came in under decades ago was somehow overly generous and now we are cutting it back to reasonable, I would agree that that in today's market it is overly generous. But at the time, previous Congresses, on a bipartisan basis, agreed to the pension. This Congress, hopefully on a bipartisan basis, will recognize that before the men and women who serve our country in harm's way fail to have the necessary implements to protect our country, we need to make cuts. This is one of the cuts. It is our share. And with that, I recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We are here today because the House Republicans instructed our committee to identify savings within our jurisdiction of approximately $80 billion over the next 10 years. Given past attacks on our Federal workers' pay and benefits, I'm disappointed that the majority has come back once again to Federal employees to take billions of additional dollars out of their pockets. The reconciliation recommendations presented by the majority today would reduce the take-home pay of nearly 3 million middle-class American workers. If this legislation becomes law, Federal employees covered under either the Civil Service Retirement System or the Federal Employees Retirement System will effectively see a 5% cut in their paychecks as a result of the increased retirement contributions they will be forced to pay. The legislation would also eliminate the FERS annuity supplement for new workers who retire before they are eligible for Social Security at age 62. This will substantially reduce their retirement benefits because, according to the Office of Personnel Management, the average annuity amount for current FERS retirees is nearly $700 per month. It was just over 2 months ago that we looked at this very same issue and passed H.R. 3630, the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012, which was signed by President Obama on February 22nd. In that bill, new hires were asked to pay an additional 2.3% out of their salaries to fund their retirement benefits. And now we are back again because the House Republicans want to squeeze even more out of these middle-class workers. Federal employees have already contributed $75 billion towards deficit reduction and the extension of unemployment benefits for millions of other workers. And if this legislation is passed, the middle-class Federal employees will take a total hit of $155 billion. At the same time, House Republicans are adamant in their refusal to ask the wealthiest Americans to contribute one additional penny towards improving our government's fiscal condition. Millionaires and billionaires will get additional tax breaks under their budget, even beyond those passed by the Bush administration. Oil companies, which are raking in more money than any industry in history, are off limits, according to the House Republicans. The Republicans argue that we should adopt this measure because we need to reduce our nation's deficit. They cite to the President who called for shared sacrifice. Well, it is not shared sacrifice when House Republicans keep coming back to the same group of middle-class workers to fund not just deficit reduction, but other government programs. Federal employees are grappling with increases in gas prices, food costs, and health care, just like the rest of all of us, all while under a 2-year pay freeze. This group of workers is now being asked to tighten their belts and contribute more money out of their limited income to pay for a fiscal problem they did not create. The proposal put forth this morning is not only unwarranted, but utterly unfair and uncompassionate. I will not be associated with a bill that takes even more money out of the pockets of those who protect our borders, support our troops, care for our wounded veterans, ensure the safety of our food and water, and provide services to millions of Americans. Instead of playing this ridiculous game of robbing from poor and middle class to fund additional tax breaks for the rich, I will offer an amendment that is designed to send a clear message to the Budget Committee and the whole House that there are more sensible approaches that we could be exploring to solve our nation's financial woes. I do hope that everyone here will rethink lending their support to the underlying bill and join in advancing a less harmful solution. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We will now open recommendations required under Section 201 of H-Con Res. 112, the concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2013. The recommendations have been distributed to all members. Without objection, the recommendations will be considered as read and open for amendment at any time. Does any member wish to speak on the recommendation? Seeing none, we will keep the record open for your opening statements and other extraneous comments till the end of the business day. Does any members wish to offer an amendment?
I have an amendment.
The ranking member is recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an amendment. I ask unanimous. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee print offered by Mr. Cummings of New York.
I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without
Mr.
objection.
Chairman, I'd like to reserve a point of order.
The gentleman reserves.
And by the way, Mr. Chairman, I'm from Maryland. She said New York.
Oh, I am terribly.
She said it.
Oh, it may be written there, but
yeah.
but we are well aware that Baltimore is your home, as we have all visited it. So we will duly note that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this is an amendment in the nature of a substitute, and it rejects the premise that we need to take additional $80 billion out of the pockets of millions of middle-class American families across the country. We're here because the House Republicans passed a budget that would give billions of dollars in additional tax breaks to the wealthy. Let me be clear, these are not the same tax cuts passed during the Bush administration. The Republican budget would go much further and give the wealthy even more. On April 12, 2012, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities issued a report examining how much the House Republicans would give to the rich under these new tax breaks. Their report concludes that those earning over $1 million a year would receive an additional $265,000 in new tax breaks. That is astounding. Let me read from the report. It says the Republican budget would, and I quote, enact new tax cuts that would provide huge windfalls to households at the top of the income scale, end of quote. It says that these new tax breaks will disproportionately harm lower income Americans, disproportionately help those at the top of the income scale, significantly worsen inequality, and increase poverty and hardship. House Republicans claim that they want to reduce the deficit, but these new tax breaks would make it worse. So House Republicans now have to find a way to pay for this. How do they do that? By attacking the poor and the middle class. Last week, the Agriculture Committee slashed the food stamp program by $33 billion as part of this reconciliation exercise. They reduced assistance to every single household receiving benefits under the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which serves 46 million people. They totally eliminated food assistance for 1.8 million people across the country, and nearly 300,000 children will lose their meals at school, on top of losing their food stamp benefits at home. What about the Ways and Means Committee? They eliminated the Social Services Block Grant, which helps 23 million children, seniors, and people with disabilities. It provides Meals on Wheels and other services for 1.7 million seniors. It provides child protective services for 1.8 million children at risk. It provides child care and other assistance for 4.4 million children. But under the House Republican plan, all of this is gone. And now it is our committee's turn. So what do the Republicans propose? They want to slash the take-home pay of millions of middle-class American workers who serve this nation every single day. And they want to slash the retirement benefits of new employees who want to serve their country. Federal workers have already contributed $75 billion toward deficit reduction and other priorities. They are operating under a 2-year pay freeze, and they are helping to fund unemployment benefits for all workers. It is fundamentally unfair to force them to pay for additional tax breaks for the rich. So my amendment says enough is enough. We reject the premise of this exercise. We strike the cuts to the middle-class workers, and we replace them with an instruction to eliminate new tax breaks for the rich that go beyond the Bush tax cuts. Mr. Chairman, let me close by saying this. It is too easy to say my amendment is not germane. It is too easy to blame some anonymous reconciliation process and cast a vote for these cuts. We come to Congress to make a difference for children, a difference for families, a difference for seniors in each of our districts. Every single member of this committee is committed to reducing the deficit, but we have to do it in a balanced way. We cannot lavish ridiculous new tax breaks on the rich while slashing programs and benefits for poor and middle-class families. I urge the adoption of the amendment.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize myself in opposition. As the gentleman from Maryland knows, germaneness does matter to this committee, and I would hope that at the conclusion he would withdraw his amendment. However, I'd like to make a few simple points. First of all, when you and all the members to my right cast their vote for Obamacare, you in fact raised taxes starting next year by a substantial amount. Warren Buffett, who talks about his 15% tax rate, leaves out the 3+% tax increase that will occur under the President's hallmark bill unless the Supreme Court acts. So there's a large tax increase coming, and yet we still have a deficit. You're instructing that we, under your resolution, that we basically stick it to the rich. But let's understand, the highest taxes, not stated rate, but actual rate in history, really in peacetime occurred under Bill Clinton. January 1st of next year, the gentleman from Maryland well knows taxes will go back to those high levels. Effectively, except for a few taxes on the middle class helped by Republicans when we were in the majority that are permanent, the taxes you're talking about that you think you need to have, in fact, are occurring. The 15% will disappear and will go back, I believe, to 28%. Taxpayers will not only pay the 35% they paid under President Clinton, but they're going to pay 3% additional. Taxes will be at the highest level in my lifetime. The fact, though, is we will still have a deficit. And as you know, sequestration will occur unless we act. So as we try to defend the men and women in uniform's ability to have the tools they need, knowing that the largest tax increase in American history is coming, knowing that if no action is taken by the Ways and Means Committee or by the democratically controlled Senate, we are going to have a huge tax increase. So although this language does and could easily be placed in the minority opinion as this goes to the Budget Committee, and I think that's an appropriate place for you to have any and all suggestions that will be looked at both by majority and minority on the Budget Committee. As you know, the Budget Committee per se is not the Ways and Means Committee, and we certainly are not. So a comment on higher taxes when they're coming, although appropriate to be in our views, does not lie within our jurisdiction. For that reason, I would urge the gentleman from Texas to continue reserving his point of order. And with that, I yield back. Does the gentleman from Texas insist on his point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I object to this amendment because it's not germane to the bill. It deals with tax policy and not the reconciliation we were directed to do.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
We will withdraw, Mr.
The gentleman withdraws. Are there further amendments? The gentleman from Utah has an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Chaffetz of Utah and Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts.
The gentleman is recognized for purposes of explaining his amendment, and the amendment is being distributed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Myself and Mr. Lynch, who's obviously been very passionate and believes strongly in this issue, we offer this amendment in the spirit of allowing Federal employees who receive accumulated and accrued annual vacation leave to be able to put this into savings. We believe strongly that this is something that, while it's done regularly in the private sector, should be something that should be afforded to those as public employees. Anything that we can do to encourage savings, the financial health of those individuals, this is something that they've earned, that they've accumulated, and we think it would be appropriate for those people to be able to make a decision and allow them to do what is so regularly done in the private sector. And so we offer this amendment as we have pursued this and various other pieces of legislation as well, but we think that this would be appropriate and timely, and we would encourage members on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
This is an excellent amendment on a bipartisan basis. I believe that as we continue to make changes in the FERS portion, it is more important than ever that we try to do all we can on the TSP side, or the equivalent of the people's 401k. So I strongly agree with the gentleman. Yield back.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time, yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank the gentleman. First of all, I just want to say that overall, I do strongly oppose the general reconciliation recommendations. However, on this point, I think the gentleman from Utah has done some tremendous work. I thank him for his leadership, and I join with him in offering this amendment that would help our dedicated Federal and postal employees improve their retirement security. Allowing Federal and postal employees to deposit unused annual or vacation leave into their thrift savings accounts upon retirement is just common sense. This change provides parity with, as you have noted, many private sector 401k plans where this option is already available to workers in the private sector. I hope that this proposal would encourage, or at least give, our Federal employees the ability to make additional contributions to their retirement, which is vital to them given the recent financial crisis, where they have seen the balance in many of their 401k plans diminish. I think this proposal is especially important given the recent attacks by some members of Congress on Federal workforce. We need to show our public servants that we value their dedication and hard work. And as you all know, this TSP lump sum proposal has been approved by this committee a couple of times before, most recently as of last week as an amendment to H.R. 4363, the phased retirement bill. I was pleased that Congressman Chaffetz and members on both sides of the aisle were able to come together on that vote in favor of this proposal. And now I urge my colleagues again to share in this bipartisan moment by voting in support of this amendment that, unlike the underlying bill, serves and promotes the retirement security of our Federal workers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate Mr. Lynch and his commitment to this, and I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this amendment and yield back.
Thank you. Does anyone else seek recognition? Mr. Chairman. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Mr. Chavis for offering this amendment, which would permit Federal employees to transfer to their thrift savings plans accounts any lump sum payments they receive upon their retirement for their unused annual leave. Like 401k plans, TSP accounts have been severely hit by the global financial crisis. Many workers have seen their balances fall steeply. This amendment would allow Federal workers to use their own money to bolster their retirement accounts. It is the tradition of our committee to ensure that the TSP plan remains in step with private sector 401k plans to the greatest extent possible. Legislation has previously been enacted that would enable lump sum payments to be made in 401k accounts. I believe that it is the primary intent of the gentleman from Utah to ensure that this same change is made to the TSP program. The committee has previously adopted this language in its consideration of H.R. 3813, and the committee agreed to it in principle just last week when discussing a bill on phased retirement. So I see no reason not to adopt it today. That said, while I support this amendment, I continue to oppose the underlying bill, which would effectively create a pay cut for all Federal employees while actually reducing the retirement annuities of some Federal employees. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Maryland, the gentleman from Virginia, the former annex to Maryland, wasn't Virginia and Maryland all one state in the Virginians' minds at one time?
No, sir.
Not even in the Virginians' minds?
Not even in their imagination.
But West Virginia was.
West Virginia was.
And California was, if you stripe it all the way, right?
Yes, absolutely, all the way
The
west.
gentleman from Eastern California is therefore recognized.
I thank the Chair, and I want the Chair to know he has my sympathy if he's paying the most taxes in his lifetime, but your country is grateful. Mr. Chairman, obviously this amendment, in fact, represents the best in the spirit of bipartisan cooperation and in giving a nod to our Federal workers that we actually do take into account their working conditions, the rules of their compensation, and flexibility in all of that. Unfortunately, while I support the amendment, it is an amendment to an underlying piece of legislation that is odious to Federal workers and Federal employees, and I think does not represent the best of this Congress or that bipartisan spirit we all say we strive to achieve. The Federal worker has given more than enough. We've frozen salaries for 2 years, and we're talking about a third. That's $30 billion a year. That would be $90 billion. We financed the payroll tax cut extension legislation, the unemployment insurance extension, with another $15 or $16 billion in pensions in incoming Federal employees, would-be Federal employees, making Federal work that much less attractive. We tried to finance transit, of all things, with which there is no nexus at all in the transportation bill that has thankfully fallen of its own weight, on the backs of existing Federal employees in terms of their pensions. And now we're going to have reconciliation instructions that are going to cost $78 billion out of the Federal employees' compensation overall. The pattern of disparagement of the Federal workforce and the work of Federal employees and the continuing assault to find this one source of revenue and no other group in America has been asked. And as the ranking member indicated in his amendment that he withdrew, certainly not the wealthiest in America have been asked to make any sacrifice. But Federal employees consistently have been asked to do so. It is wrong. It is not going to be a bipartisan effort. I believe that this reconciliation will die a deserved death when and if it gets to the Senate. And I don't believe this does us proud today, once again, picking on Federal employees, singling them out for a sacrifice as if they have made none already. And I think it's wrong, and I join my colleagues in opposing the underlying reconciliation, while I certainly commend the spirit of this amendment. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment? The gentlelady from the District of Columbia.
Mr. Chairman, there's some irony in this bipartisan amendment, which I don't think you'll find anyone against, in a bill that takes a gain disproportionately from Federal employees as compared with other Americans, and of course gives them something that many other Americans already have, which is the ability to take their accrued vacation leave and put it toward their retirement. I would argue that it is absolutely necessary for us to pass this amendment, because what you're going to see is some increased contribution that comes out of the salaries of Federal workers to their retirement system. At the very least, let them try to make up for it by depositing accrued leave into the TSP so that they can come out at least with what they had every right to expect and now may lose. I particularly object to the continued movement to Federal employees to whatever it is we need, particularly when we don't move to anybody else, particularly those who have contributed nothing. The notion, Mr. Chairman, of paying for, and a pay for is a very important thing to do, of paying for every program we can't pay for by going to Federal employees when there's a whole list of Americans and businesses who contributed nothing, seems to me ought to strike almost anyone in America as uneven, unequal, and unfair. So obviously we support this accrued vacation leave going to where it may do some good, particularly if in the same bill Federal employees are about to lose more of their salaries yet again, this time to pay for contributions to something else. And I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, to at least have this salve this in a bill that otherwise is again a very harsh blow to Federal employees.
The gentlelady yields back. I thank the gentlelady. Are there any further comments? If no members are seeking recognition, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments? The gentleman from Illinois. The clerk will read the amendment.
It's not to this bill. Okay.
I understand we have one more. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for purpose of offering an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts.
I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection.
Go ahead. I'd like to reserve a point of order.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would actually has the potential of saving about $3 billion, and I'll explain how this works. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would require enhanced oversight of the prescription drug program currently associated with the Federal Employee Health Benefit Program. This amendment would better ensure that our Federal employees, the Federal Government, and of course American taxpayers are receiving the best prescription drug benefit for their dollar. In addition, in contrast to the underlying bill, this amendment would generate meaningful government savings rather than cutting benefits for Federal employees without requiring middle-income Federal workers to make further and untenable sacrifices in the name of deficit reduction. Importantly, the rising costs of prescription drugs under the FEHBP, I'm going to keep repeating that, that's the Federal Employee Health Benefit Plan, FEHBP, has remained a long-standing concern of this committee, particularly given our legislative jurisdiction over the Federal workforce and government procurement, and our general oversight mission to curb waste, fraud, and abuse in government spending. As many of us are aware, prescription drugs currently account for approximately 30% of the total amount spent on health care premiums for Federal civilian employees across all three branches of government. So that's 30%. 30% of all costs. The employees are paying 28%, the taxpayers paying the other 72%. But of that total cost, 30% is being spent on prescription drugs. According to the Office of Personnel Management, out of the FEHBP's $40 billion cost for fiscal year 2011, over $12 billion can be attributed to prescription drug spending. $12 billion. Moreover, as noted in a February 2010 report entitled, quote, CVS Caremark's Generic Ripoff, close quote, issued by Change to Win, which is an association of unions representing 6 million members, Federal employees are actually paying substantially more for some of their prescription drugs in comparison to what an uninsured non-Federal employee would pay if they simply walked into the pharmacy. So here's the deal. You have Federal employees, okay, that are paying 28% of their premium. The taxpayer is paying 72% of their premium. It's costing us $12 billion a year. They walk into they're working through this PBM, this Pharmacy Benefit Manager. They walk into a pharmacy and they pay more. They pay more for their drugs with insurance than someone walking in off the street without insurance and just buys their drugs from CVS directly. How crazy is that? How crazy is that? And we're spending $12 billion on that. The taxpayer is getting ripped off. The Federal employees getting ripped off. And who's making out? It's these pharmacy benefit managers. And you don't have to look around for these savings. They're here if we have the courage to do this. In light of the unmanageable costs of prescription drugs under what is otherwise considered a model health care benefit plan, and given our current efforts to reduce the Federal deficit, it's imperative that we take this viable opportunity to strengthen Federal oversight of the Federal Government's prescription drug program for Federal workers. In particular, we must revamp the Byzantine process which currently allows pharmacy benefit managers and companies to significantly overcharge the Federal Government for the cost of Federal worker prescription drugs. To this end, my amendment would order the Office of Personnel Management to contract with one pharmaceutical management entity or firm for the purpose of administering the prescription element of the Federal Employee Health Benefit Program. In addition, my amendment would add the Office of OPM, Office of Personnel Management, on behalf of Federal employees that participate in the Federal Employee Health Benefit Program to the current list of Federal agencies that receive statutory pricing for the cost of prescription drugs. Simply put, my amendment has the potential to decrease the amount that the Federal Government is spending on its employee prescription program by at least 24% from the average manufacturer price, and will also serve to increase the level of transparency associated with the cost of our employee drugs. Now, we don't get the information from the PBMs on how much profit they're making. We went to court on that. The judge ruled that was proprietary. So what we're trying to do is put this on the Federal procurement schedule so that we all know what we're being charged and what we're being paid and what the markup is on this. I believe that this issue needs to be resolved once and for all. While I have my concerns about the underlying reconciliation measure, I do think this amendment is reflective of the types of reforms that we should be advancing instead of other potentially harmful anti-Federal employee measures. Nevertheless, I'm requesting that this amendment be added onto the base bill. The amendment also contains corresponding language to allow for a reduction in the proposed employee retirement contribution rates to account for the savings from having statutory pricing. So basically, I'll cut this short. We're going to generate some savings here. It could be as much as $3 billion. You're looking, well, the base bill is looking to cut from Federal employees by increasing their contributions to their pension. And what I'm saying is we can save it this way by being more efficient with the prescription drug program. Use that savings instead of cutting pensions or asking the Federal employees to contribute more. So, look, we're supposed to be all about oversight, stopping waste, fraud, and abuse. This situation is terrible. This is terrible. There are a lot of lobbyists up here on behalf of the drug companies. We are outmatched, members of Congress. But the day when we could afford to waste $3 billion, those days are over. This is big money. And if we do this, we'll be helping the taxpayer enormously, but we'll also be helping these Federal employees who I think are also being ripped off. So I thank the Chairman for the time, and I
would the gentleman yield?
Sure, I will.
Suspecting that the gentleman is going to insist on his point of order, I would like to tell you that I concur with your frustration that we can do better to manage the prescription drug portion of our health care. As you know, the Postmaster has the authority and is looking into something very similar to this, taking control of his broad health care of 1 million current and retirees, and that, in fact, this may very well be an item that he would be able to employ for that portion, the postal portion. Additionally, I will commit to you as the Chairman that either at full or subcommittee, we will look at this and make every effort to try to get it costed out. Regrettably, it's not within the germaneness of what we're working on today, nor do we have a score on it. But I think if the gentleman will have patience, we will work with you on what you have seen for some time to be an important issue. And I agree with you that we should see if there are ways to dramatically reduce these costs by giving a competitive advantage to the American people as a large buyer of pharmaceuticals. So I can't support this in this bill because of germaneness and because we don't have a score, but it doesn't change the fact that the gentleman has good points, one that the Postmaster General has also made. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Has the point been raised? I know the gentleman had reserved the point of order. Is that what's lying against this? The amendment?
It is, because we don't deal with this.
Okay. Then may I? I'm looking for time in response to the ruling.
If the gentleman would like to extend, I think we'll all prefer that. The gentleman's given an additional 3 minutes.
Look, I don't know the grounds that the gentleman is using for saying that the bill is not germane, especially where we've just greatly expanded the scope of the bill by accepting Mr. Chaffetz's motion on the TSP. So I don't know what your parameters are for germaneness and non-germaneness, because we've got a pretty wide.
If the gentleman would yield,
I yield.
Although no point of order was raised on the other one, TSP is within retirement, and that was the contributions to retirement. The fact is that we went to the parliamentarian, got an opinion on your amendment, and I believe it's been given to your side, that it's outside the scope. It is not outside the scope of this committee's jurisdiction, and if we were planning on scoring it, we would have, in fact, done more work in preparation to find out what the real savings would be. As you know, OPM has not promoted this idea that they would like to do it, and they have not sought scoring. The commitment I made to you earlier is that I would seek both that, a conversation with Mr. Perry. We can do that jointly. We can have him up here to talk about how he viewed it. And then, of course, a real question of what we believe the savings would be and have it scored. I'm not opposed to anything that saves the taxpayers money. It simply doesn't fall within this, nor are we ripe to know what we'd really save. And your amendment, remember,
Mr. Chairman, you're using all my time. You gave me 3 minutes, and you talked for me.
I'll give you what you need, if you don't mind. But the problem is you're seeking an offset, and if we think about it, if it was with germane, we'd still probably vote it down, because we'd be looking at an offset of an unknown against a known, and you can see where that wouldn't be ripe today.
No,
I will work with the gentleman on that.
I think what we'll be looking at, and just as you have said in the general sense, reclaiming my time, that Mr. Chaffetz's bill generally pertains to retirement, my amendment generally pertains to saving the taxpayer money, which is in reconciliation. That's the purpose of this, is to generate savings. And so this bill has look, right now we don't know what things cost in terms of per unit, but we do know the Federal Government's spending about $12 billion, 40% of the budget, on pharmaceuticals. So, and the prices aren't out there. What I'm saying is put it on the Federal procurement schedule. We'll know what the price is, and if we get the 24% of the average manufacturer's price, that comes out to $3 billion. So that's what I'm looking at in terms of that. But again, in terms of germaneness, there has been great leeway afforded to my dear friend from Utah, and I appreciate that, because I was a co-sponsor on his amendment. And I'm just looking for some consistency. I know Oscar Wilde said that consistency is the last refuge of the unimaginative, but I'm looking for a little consistency in this respect. And I think that if we're really about saving money, that's what this amendment is about. It's stopping the rip-off of the taxpayer, stopping the rip-off of the Federal employees. It's exactly what, at least facially, this bill is all about. And I know it doesn't whack at Federal employees, but that is not a deficit that I don't take points off of that just because it doesn't whack at Federal employees.
If the gentleman would yield.
I will yield.
My understanding is that the Chaffetz-Lynch amendment is going to cost quite a bit and will actually reduce the total amount of savings under reconciliation.
Well, let me put this in. This saves about $3 billion.
And I appreciate that may be true in the future, and I look forward to working with the gentleman on a separate bill that is vetted. Does the gentleman continue to reserve, or does he insist on his point of order?
Mr. Chairman, despite agreeing with the gentleman that we need to save the taxpayers and the government money, I'm going to have to continue to insist upon my point of order that it's not germane, but do look forward to finding these savings in the future.
I thank the gentleman.
All right. You guys have suffered enough. I'll yield back my time.
Does the gentleman withdraw his amendment?
Yeah, I'll withdraw.
The gentleman withdraws. Are there any further amendments? Seeing none. If there is no further discussion, I move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform adopt the recommendations submitted to them, to submit them to the Committee on Budget. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. It is agreed to.
Roll call. Roll call.
A recorded vote on the committee, a recorded vote on the committee print will be postponed pursuant to committee rules. The committee will now consider H.R. 2008, the Keeping Politics Out of Federal Contracting Act of 2011, and I recognize myself for an opening statement. I introduced last year H.R. 2008, Keep Politics Out of Federal Contracting Act, in response to a draft executive order created by this administration. The draft executive order would politicize the procurement process by having agencies collect political information of contractors and their employees. Such a dictate by the administration would have a chilling effect on contractors who could be concerned their own political expressions could be weighed when agencies decide whether to award them a new contract or extension of existing one. Although the draft executive order was circulated last year, Congress has yet to enact a comprehensive government-wide ban preventing the executive branch from demanding political information from those who seek to do business with the government and the unions of those companies. We are therefore considering my bill today, which reaffirms the fundamental principle that Federal contracts should be awarded free of all political consideration and be based on the best value for the taxpayer. The bill narrowly prohibits a Federal agency from collecting the political information of contractors and their employees, including their unions, as part of any type of request for proposal in anticipation of any type of contract. It prohibits the agency from using political information received from any source as a factor in source selection decision process of new contracts, or in making decisions related to modifications or extension of existing contracts. And finally, it prohibits databases that were designed to be used by contracting officers to determine the responsibility of bidders to used as repositories for political information, Ultimately, the bill preempts any executive order designed to silence or intimidate job creators in America who are persuaded enough to support any cause. Businesses should not have to determine and report to the government on whether certain employees contributed to organizations that support or oppose positions on issues including gay marriage, abortion, and a host of others. Imagine your employer asking for such information. Today, your employer cannot ask you what your politics are, whether you are a member of the Tea Party, or how you voted in the last election, or who you have given money to. If we do not act, some future administration could well create a situation in which we are asked to ask employees questions that we have no right to ask in order to deliver them to a contracting officer who has no valid use for that information except to assert an ideology of the contracting officer or the administration and not, in fact, the best value to the American people. I believe today this is narrow and necessary in order to make a bipartisan statement about the fact that politics has no business in contracting, and no committee has more close jurisdiction and need to do that than this committee. With that, I recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, H.R. 2008, the Keeping Politics Out of the Federal Contracting Act, is both unnecessary and unwise. In fact, an article in this morning's Washington Post suggests that, and I quote, much of the political spending over the next 6 months will come from sources invisible to the public. I ask unanimous consent to enter the article into the record.
Without objection.
Transparency and disclosure of political contributions by everyone, corporations, unions, and individuals, should be our goal. In response to Citizens United and the emergence of super PACs, the administration last year circulated a draft executive order that would have required disclosures by government contractors of their political contributions, particularly to third-party groups that seek to influence the outcome of Federal elections. The draft EO was greeted by a somewhat hysterical response from those who opposed it. The bill seemed to suggest that requiring government contractors to disclose more information about their political donations is bad policy because it could cause people in power to retaliate against them for political reasons. I have a fundamental problem with this premise. Under this logic, all campaign disclosures would be bad, not just new ones. Government contractors already disclose contributions and expenditures by their PACs and those who contribute to them. Contributions by the officers and directors of government contractors are also required to be disclosed. Should we eliminate those provisions too? Of course not. A second argument made by proponents of this bill is that contracting officers might review political contributions in order to reward allies or punish foes by awarding or withholding government contracts. Again, Federal procurement laws prohibit this. A third argument, that the draft executive order violates the First Amendment, is also misplaced. Even in the recent case of Citizens United, 8 of 9 justices agreed that campaign disclosure rules are consistent with the First Amendment because they do not prohibit contributions and do not prevent anyone from speaking. Frankly, the draft EO could have been drafted differently, in my opinion. For example, agency heads were required to collect this information rather than the Federal Election Commission, which I believe is more appropriate body to do that. But I do not believe the arguments in favor of this bill have merit. And for these reasons, I urge members to oppose it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to support the bill. While I certainly agree with the sentiments just expressed by the ranking member, for whom I have great respect, I believe that the proposed executive order last year was well-intentioned but misguided. Why we would single out one potential group of potential donors and target them for special attention. And by the way, these are a group of potential donors to political campaigns who are still subject to regular Federal election laws, including disclosure. I don't know. And I believe that it would have had the unintended but nonetheless real effect, chilling effect, of actually discouraging participation in the political arena. And I'm not sure that that's a wise policy. I absolutely support the sentiments the ranking member just expressed with respect to transparency and accountability, and I certainly agree with him that the Citizens United decision, which I think is an entirely different kind of category, I think ranks up there with Dred Scott as one of the single worst and most momentous decisions ever rendered by a Supreme Court, because it's going to upend our polity. And we've already seen it in Republican primaries this year, where money, anonymous donors, super PACs, suddenly have upended the process and even superseded the role of political parties in our politics. And I think the more we see of that, the less as a people we're going to like it. But that's not the underlying issue here. I think this is designed, this legislation, although it is codified in other provisions, including in the Defense Authorization Bill and in financial services legislation, this bill does what it says, which is to essentially preempt and nullify the possibility of an executive order that would target one narrow group, but an important one, from special consideration in terms of political accountability. I think that's unwise public policy, however good the intentions. and I join the Chairman in his sentiments.
I thank the gentleman. We will now open the bill H.R. 2008 for consideration. Without objection, H.R. 2008 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any time. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2008, a bill to amend Title 41 United States Code to prohibit inserting politics into the Federal acquisition process by prohibiting the submission of political contribution information as a condition of receiving a Federal contract.
Does any member further wish to speak on the bill? Does any member have an amendment to offer? If there are no amendments, I'll flip to the next page. If there is no further discussion, I move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report the bill H.R. 2008 to the House with the recommendation it do pass. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The committee will now consider H.R. 4078, the Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act of 2012. Without objection, H.R. 4078 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4078, a bill to provide that no agency may take any significant regulatory action until the unemployment rate is equal to or less than 6.0%.
I recognize myself for an amendment. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which will be has already been distributed, and without objection, the amendment will be considered read and as original text for purpose of amendment. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. The committee has put great focus on Federal regulatory state and its impact on the economy. Since taking the chairmanship, we have held 7 full committee hearings and 11 subcommittee hearings and issued 2 reports and sent countless letters on this topic. President Obama, the Chief Regulatory Officer, Cass Sunstein, has called the committee's work constructive and important. And yet, in a new report issued by the Obama administration, 106 new major rules in the first 3 years, adding more than $46 billion a year of cost to taxpayers, have been passed. To compare this, this is nearly 4 times the number and more than 5 times the cost in major rules issued by the Bush administration in their first 3 years. More importantly, these are different times. We are in a recession. We, in fact, cannot absorb these costs as easily as in good times. And so particularly at this time, my bill seeks to deal with particularly those that cost $100 million or more, and realize that if we can forestall all but the most essential regulations, we can, in fact, reduce the unemployment rate, bring it down, and then look at bills like Dodd-Frank, Obamacare, EPA, and many others. That's not to say that critical rules need not be considered. In fact, my bill allows for those critical bills to be considered. Additionally, there will be a number of amendments offered. I believe that in most cases the underlying bill deals with this, but more importantly, I'm hoping that on a bipartisan basis we can, in fact, create those 200,000 jobs or more every month until the unemployment rate falls to 6%. Today, the markup of H.R. 4078, the Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act of 2012, aims to give certainty and predictability to job creators that, in fact, the regulations they operate under will be the regulations, in most cases, they operate under in the foreseeable future. That is the kind of certainty that will increase investment both by U.S. citizens and by foreign companies in the U.S. It allows for construction to go forward at a faster pace, and without a doubt, will in fact allow us to drive down the unemployment rate quicker than otherwise. In fact, this is the kind of job stimulus that we should have done 3 years ago. I want to particularly thank Mr. Ripple and Mr. Griffin for their assistance in making this bill that much better and their hard work in this effort. I ask unanimous consent that the letters from the Chamber of Commerce, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, and the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council in support of H.R. 4078 and H.R. 4607 be entered in the record. Without objection, I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Maryland, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I oppose H.R. 4078, the Regulatory Freeze for Jobs Act of 2012, which is based on the false premise that business investment and hiring is being held back by uncertainty over future regulations. The bill disregards the evidence from economists on both sides of the political spectrum that regulations do not negatively impact the economy for job growth. In fact, there is substantial evidence that the opposite is in fact true. It is not only economists that dispute the premise of this legislation, but actual businessmen and women. Recent surveys by the American Sustainable Business Council, the Main Street Alliance, and the Small Business Majority show that small businesses do not see regulations as their #1 problem. Instead, the vast majority of small business owners believe weak demand is the primary problem their businesses face right now, not regulations. This legislation is extremely misguided and will produce terrible results for the American people. As Cass Sistine stated at an Oversight Committee hearing last September, a moratorium would not be a scalpel or a machete. It would be more like a nuclear bomb, in the sense that it would prevent regulations that cost very little and have very significant economic or public health benefits. Freezing all significant regulatory actions has the potential to do great harm both to our economy and the health and safety of millions of Americans. I'd like to share a statement that eloquently sums up the importance of safety regulations by a woman who lost her father as a result of injuries he suffered from an industrial accident at an oil refinery. And I quote, "Regulations do not kill jobs. They keep jobs from killing workers. Regulations are vital to keep our workers safe on the job, to ensure that mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, sons, and husbands come home to their families at the end of the workday," end of quote. Why does it make sense to allow regulation that would protect this woman's father if the national unemployment rate is 5.9, but not if it's 6.1%? Of course, that makes no sense at all. But that is exactly what this bill would do. The bill would go beyond freezing regulations. CBO has found that it would freeze routine updates to government programs. For example, payment rates for services provided by hospitals, physicians, and other Medicare providers would be frozen at current levels. The bottom line is that regulations save lives, protect the health and safety of hundreds of millions of Americans, and provide protections that are critical to the functioning of a healthy economy. The committee has held more than 20 hearings targeting regulations this Congress. This legislation takes this committee anti-regulatory crusade to new heights, and I'm urging every member to oppose it. I appreciate the fact that the majority made an attempt to address some of the concerns raised in the Judiciary Committee markup of the Regulatory Freeze Act. Unfortunately, I do believe this substitute makes sufficient improvements to the original bill because it still provides a 2-year moratorium if the unemployment rate is above 6%. This substitute is still based on the same fundamentally flawed logic that the original bill is based on. It would say that a regulation to protect children from lead exposure is okay when the unemployment rate is 5.9%. But that very same regulation wouldn't be allowed if the employment rate is 6.1%. Again, this makes no sense. The health and safety of our nation's children and our entire society should not depend on the tenths of a percentage in the national unemployment rate. This moratorium would be extremely harmful to both our economy and the health and safety of the American people, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his statement. We'll hold the record open until the end of the day for any members who would like to submit a written statement. Does any member wish to speak on the legislation? The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank the Chair. Mr. Chairman, this bill is based on an utterly false but repeated premise that regulation of any kind kills jobs. In fact, there's plenty of empirical evidence to the contrary, that over the years, ever since Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican president, responded to the so-called muckrakers, led by Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, about an unregulated environment known as the jungle, actually the United States has prospered. We created jobs, but we made the workplace safer. We made food an unadulterated item for consumption for the American people. We protected people in terms of drugs. You know, I think back in my own family. My great-grandfather was killed in an industrial accident in Massachusetts in an unregulated work environment. No pension was left for his widow or his children. My grandfather had to start work at a very young age and leave school in order to help provide for the family. Maybe some think that social Darwinism is a preferred way for the United States to go. I do not, and I think most Americans do not. And we can repeat the premise that regulation is job killing, but it's not true. And there are many, many, many good examples where regulation has actually helped steer commerce, has created jobs, has led to industry revitalizing and avoiding obsolescence. We had a hearing here about pending regulation on coal-fired power plants, where utilities actually admitted that in many cases they welcomed the pending regulation because it allowed them to retrofit plants, it allowed them to make new investments, it finally allowed them to close inefficient, expensive, obsolete plants. So actually regulation can be a force for innovation, job creation, and improve American competitiveness. The fundamental premise of this law and the absurdity of the premise that no regulation of any kind can go into place tied to the unemployment level, I think would be enormously injurious to the United States' economic performance and would very much affect our competitive edge as a great country and economic power. I urge its defeat.
I recognize the gentlelady from Ms. Maloney from New York.
I would like to speak in opposition to this and be associated with the comments of my two colleagues. The fact that the Republicans' assumption that regulations are an obstacle to job creation is just flat out false. Though it may be a nice talking point, it has been thoroughly discredited by the Economic Policy Institute, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and leading economists. It just simply does not work that way. Though I do agree that whenever we find regulations that are not worth their cost, we should do away with them as quickly as possible. President Obama mentioned one such regulation in his State of the Union address about milk spills. It was a dumb rule. It was done away with. Next, bring on another dumb rule and we'll do away with it. But there are many rules that save people's lives. And thoughtful and measured regulations helps to safeguard our air quality, prevent water pollution, safeguard our drugs and medical equipment, and sees to it that our food is safe. Though it's a nice fantasy to believe that market forces alone will magically keep our food supply safe, consumers don't really have the freedom to simply choose another brand for the next time they go shopping if they die from a foodborne illness. If the drug a pregnant woman takes causes severe birth defects to her newborn child, she isn't comfortable by knowing that the pharmaceutical company's market share may decrease. When lives and health and well-being are at stake, people must come first. For instance, take note of the recent discovery of mad cow disease here in the United States. The presence of that disease here in the U.S. would put lives at risk if regulations were not put in place. In cases like that, a swift and sure regulatory response is called for to restore consumer confidence and safeguard the food supply no matter what the unemployment rate is. A no new rules rule like the one that is proposed by our Republican colleagues could produce unforeseen consequences that I do not even want to think about. What happens when the next blowout preventer on a drilling rig blows out? Do we just sit by and say, wish we could issue a sensible regulation to prevent this from happening again, but the law is the law. The unemployment rate is above 6%, absolutely no new regulations. What happens when the next mine caves in and takes the lives of miners? Do we just tell them, too bad, tough luck, hope it doesn't happen again, but our hands are tied, no new rules, our unemployment rate is above 6%. Simply put, if we prohibit the passage of any new and needed regulation simply because it makes a nice political talking point, we will put American lives and health at risk, and all for nothing. So I would urge my colleagues to vote against this ill-conceived law. It is just plain wrong. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from the district. Oh, I'm sorry. The gentleman from who seeks recognition on this side?
I do, but I think both of us.
Well, you're the senior member. The gentleman from Ohio.
And I'll be brief, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to enter into the record story from a couple months ago. Health costs, government regulations curb small business hiring. The premise from the last couple of speakers on the other side is that regulations don't hurt jobs. But according to this Gallup survey, that statement contradicts what half of small business owners in this country say. Approximately half say, 48% say, regulations are making it tough to hire people. And so all we're saying is let's just have a reasonable time out in this legislation so that we can begin to get our economy moving again. And with that, I'd ask for unanimous consent to enter this into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman yield back. The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, the causes of the Great Recession are now well documented and well known. It was the mortgage crisis, and it was a failure to regulate entire sections of the economy, such a failure that it has taken a major piece of legislation to correct that. The problem I have with this provision is that it does not take into account how the Administrative Procedure Act in fact operates. The cost-benefit sections of the Act are planted in the Act so that regulators can see whether there is an effect that is significant, as the bill would have it, on the economy, or for that matter, on other parts of society. This is a very controversial subject, cost-benefit of regulation. So to sit here and perpetuate the easy myth that the recovery is slower than we would like because of regulations without any demonstrable facts should be beneath this committee. Moreover, I have great issues with the way the bill apparently is worded. I mean, I don't understand this to be anything more than another regulation on top of regulations full of paperwork that has to be met. Adversely affects in a material way the economy, a sector of the economy, productivity, competition, jobs, the environment, public health or safety, small entities or state and local or tribal governments or communities. Why not just throw in the kitchen sink?
Would the gentlelady yield for clarification?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
All of that language is from the existing Act. We're reciting from the Act, and the gentlelady is right. It can be a little confusing, but it is in law.
Well, if it's in law and we already have to take that into effect, what is the point here? What is the point here of an additional provision, except to try to wipe out all regulations regardless of their cost beneficial effect, Mr. Chairman?
I thank the gentlelady. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's one of those moments that, as I process through as a freshman, how different I think sometimes. The impression is the reason we have a slow economy is because we don't have enough central control on the economy. If only we had more government control in every sector of the economy, if only we had more regulations, this thing would really be humming. And it's this, that we have way too much economic freedom in America. We need less economic freedom so we can have more economic prosperity. That really gets me. At some point, you move from regulating businesses to running a business when you define every single aspect of how they do business day to day. We are not a country that's based on the Federal Government running every business. We regulate industries, and no one on this side of the aisle is saying we need to have no regulations. And I understand the hyperbole of saying children will die and mines will cave in and there will be oil spills everywhere if we pass this. But all of those are based on previous regulations that a company violated a regulation on the book. They broke the law already and already violated that regulation. And if there was a major violation or if there was a new regulation that was required, we would do something really odd. We would actually bring it to Congress rather than have a regulation bureaucracy create new laws around Congress. Now, the issue is business after business tells me in my district that they are not going to hire new people because they have an unstable regulatory environment. The new people they are hiring are compliance officers. So it is true, new people are being hired because of regulations, but they're not producing goods and services. They're producing paperwork to come to Washington, D.C. That is not the type of hiring that we want to see in America. If we're going to be competitive globally, it's not because we have the absolute best bureaucracy in the world. It's going to be because we have the best goods and services in the world. And so it is a frustrating thing to say, we can't stop creating more regulations, because if we ever stop creating more regulations, we're going to hurt the economy, or we're going to slow down hiring, or we're going to somehow tilt this one direction or the other. Job creation should be based on a free market economy. This simply does one simple thing. If we're going to add new regulations, it needs to come back to the legislative branch for the next 2 years or at a time when we have a difficult economy, so we do not have a regulator saying to us, I don't care if this affects the economy, I'm going to add this new regulation on it. One more quick thing on it. I can't tell you how many community banks and bankers that I've talked to that say the issue with Dodd-Frank and the issue with all the regulations that are coming down that were supposed to hit on the big banks. Well, those regulations that were supposed to be for the big banks are now suggestions and now guidelines and now coming down to the community banks as well. So what was designed on a regulation to hit the too big to fail is now coming down on every small community bank. And in a community bank of 20 people, can't hire new people to do loans, can't hire new people as tellers. They have to hire new people as compliance people, and they can't stop the stream of new regulations coming at them. All that American business wants is a moment to breathe. Give us a moment to catch up on the number of regulations coming. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief. Before I got to Congress, I was a journalist back at the time when journalism actually dealt with facts. And I'm compelled to clarify Mr. Jordan's description of the Gallup survey. First of all, the Gallup survey was not of small businesses generally in the United States. It was only of businesses who said they were not going to hire people, and they asked them why they were not going to hire. Somewhere down the list, the first item on the survey was a 78 or 77% who said they just didn't need the employees. They were talking about general business conditions. Fifth on the list was 48% of those who said they were not going to hire said they were not going to hire because of projected health care costs. They were never asked about the Affordable Care Act. Anywhere in that survey, the words don't appear. So I'm glad that Mr. Jordan is actually submitting that survey for the record so that anyone who reads the survey will actually understand what it is. And I yield back.
Gentleman, yield?
Yes, I will yield.
You don't think they knew about the Affordable Care Act? You don't think they, even just because they weren't asked about it doesn't mean they didn't take it. They're smart business people. Of course they know what's coming. That's the whole point.
Reclaiming my time, I think most small businesses have been experiencing for a number of years premium increases of 20, 30, 38%, and they understand that they are concerned about increased health care costs wherever they come from.
Well, that's true.
I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
How long have you been out of journalism?
How long have I been out of journalism?
Well, I've been here 12 years. I just want to know when journalism dealt in facts.
Actually, it was probably before I got here.
The gentleman yields.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Does any member wish to offer an amendment? If there's no further discussion, you got an amendment? Then you're that gentleman. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment at the desk.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4078, offered by Mr. Yarmouth of Kentucky.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment I'm offering exempts from the proposed moratorium any rule or regulation that is related to the health or safety of United States service members and veterans. Service members and veterans are best served when the agencies that serve them can implement critical treatment in a timely and responsive manner. 2 years ago, Congress passed the Caregivers and Veterans Omnibus Health Services Act, which provides certain medical, travel, training, and financial benefits to caregivers of veterans and service members who were seriously injured in the line of duty after September 11th. It is an entirely sensible policy. Serious injuries that were once fatal are now treatable, but they often require unique, dedicated care. If a veteran chooses a family member to provide that vital care and that family member is able, we provide assistance and support services for them. A new rule was required for the VA to implement that program. In fact, in outlining its regulatory priorities earlier this year, the VA specifically cited extending new benefits to caregivers as a top regulatory priority, alongside a comprehensive review of all agency regulations. By freezing regulations arbitrarily, Congress would not only step between veterans and their caregivers, Congress would be unable to provide any new benefits for our veterans and service members. My amendment ensures that that doesn't happen. Mr. Chairman, over the next 5 years, more than 1 million veterans will come home. I don't believe that anyone here can argue in good faith that just because the economy hasn't fully recovered, members of the military and veterans are not entitled to the best and most current health care. They deserve far better than that, and I hope that every member agrees and will support this amendment. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Thank the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman. Go ahead.
Well, it's in my. I have an amendment at the desk in the form of a secondary amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Issa of California to the amendment offered by Mr. Yarmouth of Kentucky.
I recognize myself for purpose of explaining the amendment. I join with the gentleman in recognizing that 1 million soldiers, sailors, and Marines will come home over the next year, and countless soldiers, sailors, and Marines of all ages will need care. Very clearly, when we talk about regulatory impediments to job creation, it is not the intention of this committee to be talking about those regulations that may become needed because of health care concerns or, in fact, new developments in medicine or, as my generation experienced, Agent Orange and other things that may come to pass that we don't know about today. So for that reason, I've limited your amendment but completely agree that your amendment with the designation that it exempts the Department of Defense and Veteran Affairs in their regulatory role, thus saying that the EPA can't simply use a backdoor of veterans to do something broadly, but in fact, when it comes to our men and women in uniform and those who have served in the past, very clearly we'd like to have the agencies that oversee their well-being be able to continue to work as normal, and I see no impediment to job creation whatsoever. I thank the gentleman, offer my amendment, and would recognize or yield to the gentleman for his comments.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that is a very reasonable amendment to my amendment. I appreciate the support for the concept, and I would be happy to accept your amendment. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Is there any, the gentleman from Mr. Cummings is recognized.
I'd just like to speak on the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I support the amended amendment, which would ensure that regulatory protections for veterans and members of our armed services aren't compromised because of a misguided notion that all regulations are bad. Regulations specifying a veteran's eligibility for health care, GI Bill benefits, and preference in hiring are essential to ensuring that our veterans are able to claim the benefits they've earned, and I hope every member will support this amendment. I also ask unanimous consent to introduce a letter from the Coalition of Sensible Safeguards dated April 25, 2012, and an April 23, 2011 joint report issued by the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards outlining the high costs regulatory moratorium would impose on society in terms of preventable deaths, illnesses, and injuries.
Without objection. The question now occurs on the amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute offered by myself. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed? In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman, Mr. Yarmouth. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments?
I have an amendment.
Now we have the gentleman from Illinois who was so quick on the draw earlier. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered to H.R. 4078, offered by Mr. Davis of Illinois.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've always been led to believe that you can measure the effectiveness of a society by how well it treats its young, how well it treats its elderly, and how well it treats those who have difficulty caring for themselves. With that precept, the amendment that I'm offering exempts from the proposed moratorium any rule or regulation that is related to the health or safety of senior citizens. All of us recognize that if we should live long enough, we will become seniors. And seniors are one of the most vulnerable populations in need of regulatory protections. There is a vast network of regulations affecting senior citizens, from requirements for nursing facilities under Medicaid and Medicare to Social Security guidelines and protections against various forms of discrimination. Moreover, in its cost estimate for H.R. 4078, CBO has found that it would freeze routine updates to government programs like Medicare. This could reap havoc on the Medicare system and interfere with access to quality health care for seniors. If one should visit many nursing homes and places where senior citizens live, you can readily and easily see that the need to protect their environment, to protect their living conditions, and to protect their health and well-being is paramount. So I would ask that we put this category of individuals into a safety net position. And I would urge members to vote for this amendment because I think it would protect some of the most vulnerable members of our society, our senior citizens. And with that,
would the gentleman yield?
Yes, be delighted.
I've read your amendment, and although I agree with the fundamental concerns, as it's currently written, I can't see that EPA, OSHA, and every other agency wouldn't fall within this broad purview. In other words, air, water, all forms of safety, everything can affect a senior because seniors, they drive on the highways, they golf, they recreate, they do everything that everyone else does. If the gentleman would work with both staffs to limit this to the agencies that oversee specifics, in other words, Medicare and the like, we certainly would be happy to look at it as directly related to seniors. Otherwise, I suspect that we'd be unable to support it just because what applies to seniors in this current amendment applies to everyone in our country.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your recognition of the intent of this legislation and what it purports to do, and I would be delighted to work with you and staff to see if we couldn't reshape it to the extent that it might be useful and pass.
Then without objection, I ask that this amendment be withdrawn to be, without prejudice, to be resubmitted at any time. Without objection. Are there any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for, or sorry, the clerk will read the amendment.
This would be the amendment referring to children.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4078, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the amendment I'm offering is simple and straightforward. It exempts from the proposed moratorium rules or regulations that are related to children's health or safety. Under this bill, as amended by Mr. Issa, an agency would be prohibited from issuing a major rule aimed at protecting the health and safety of children for 2 years or until the unemployment rate is above 6%. There is no reason to tie the health or safety of a child to the national unemployment rate. Many of you have heard me say before that our children are the living messages we send to a future we will never see. We have an obligation to ensure our children are safe and healthy so they can be a part of that future. I understand that there is an exception in the bill for regulations that protect against so-called imminent threats to health or safety, but that is not enough. Regulations play a critical role in protecting our children every single day. Regulations ensure that children are safe in cars and cribs. They ensure that the toys they play with are not made from poisonous materials. They protect children from brain damage by requiring disclosure of lead-based paint hazards in homes and apartments. Low-income children's access to quality health care depends on regulations that detail the provision of services and reimbursement systems that support Medicaid. If Medicaid payments, updates are stalled as a result of H.R. 4078, I feel children will not get the health care services they need. I hope that every member agrees with me and will support this amendment. And with that, I yield back.
For what reasons does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Well, I would just echo what the Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I would just echo what the Chairman indicated to the last amendment. This seems amendment seems unnecessary. The bill provides for imminent safety and health concerns and is just overly broad. And frankly, the bill also gives the President great latitude if, in fact, he feels there is some pressing threat to children's safety to deal with that. So, again, I would argue I just think it's unnecessary, and the bill already takes care of this this valid concern.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Virginia.
I'm in support of the ranking member's amendment, and listening to my friend from Ohio, if he thinks the amendment is unnecessary because the underlying bill would in general address this issue, then that's actually an argument for accepting the amendment, just to make sure that the safety of children is paramount in our minds. But I happen to believe that obviously regulation that protects our children is pretty fundamental, pretty much expected by most Americans, and I think could only improve an otherwise flawed bill, and I support the amendment.
I recognize myself in opposition. The gentleman from Virginia has rhetorically would be right, except that the amendment as written simply means you can do anything and name it after the health and safety of children. The bill, as it's written, clearly does provide safeguards. And remember, we're talking about major bills, things which are going to have an impact of $100 million or more. Sadly, one of the gaping holes in this bill is that this administration has ruthlessly and repeatedly claimed something didn't cost $100 million, when in fact, in some cases, it will cost as much as $1 trillion. It's one of the areas of our regulatory oversight that is a separate problem, that just because you say it won't cost $100 million doesn't mean it won't cost $100 million. But this is a case in which the final rule is estimated to cost over $100 million, and we're simply causing it to take, from this day, effectively 2 years. And I know that the gentleman means well to say that there's something impending that we're going to have to act on tomorrow that cost over $100 million that will affect the health and safety of children, that in fact we hadn't anticipated, but we're going to have to do it. I might suggest that if there is a bona fide risk to health and safety of our seniors, of our children, of middle-aged men, that we could actually take it up by act of Congress. And if it was so meritorious, I have no doubt that it would pass. So let's remember, this is a bill to say that the regulatory state, the entity that acts without further acts of Congress, shall be limited for a short period of time if unemployment stays as high as it is from a very small set of new regulations, but the ones that are considered to be the most impactful to job creation. So I appreciate the gentleman's saying that it would be rhetorically the same, but it wouldn't be. With that, I yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question is, as there is no further person seeking recognition, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The gentleman requests a recorded vote. As a recorded vote is requested, pursuant to the rules, the vote will be postponed.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
For what the gentleman will state his parliamentary inquiry.
Just some clarification. When in postponing the votes, does the chairman have an hour or time when we might expect such votes, just for the purpose of trying to adjust it?
You don't have plans for lunch, do you?
No, lunch is not the problem.
Although we don't yet have a time, the general expectation, just a second, gentlelady, the general expectation is that there's a recorded vote expected approximately 1 o'clock now. And our expectation is that we will conclude all business other than the rolled votes prior to that time. So if you don't hear otherwise, for any reason, you can assume that immediately following the last of that first set of recorded votes, we would reassemble here for those votes. I do not anticipate, even if we conclude quite a bit earlier, having any vote or calling you back until that time certain after the first recorded votes.
I thank the Chair.
Thank you. The gentlelady from New York. The clerk will read the amendment. Do you have an amendment for the gentlelady from New York?
We're getting it. Ms. Maloney's?
Yes. Now the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4078, offered by Ms. Maloney of New York.
Okay,
the gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are many things, Mr. Chairman, you and I have worked together on this past year, including the bill on the floor yesterday, but this is not one of them. That is why I have an amendment at the desk that I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will give serious consideration to. I am offering an amendment that makes an exception to this bill for any rule or regulation related to ensuring the equal treatment of women and minorities. And my amendment talks about the equal treatment to them in these areas: pay disparity, retaliatory discharge, hostile work environment, sexual harassment, voting rights, and access to education. So I hope that you will at least consider this modest amendment, one to lessen the costly effects of inequality on those who can afford it least, women and minorities. Minorities and women are still not equals among equals, and they are finding it especially hard to find their footing during these tough times. Though the general unemployment rate is 8.2%, the rate among blacks is a punishing 14%. Women and minorities continue to have serious concerns about their economic security, and they have recovered very slowly from this recession. I know that I have asked this question many times in this committee, but when I look at your bill, I have to once again ask, where are the women. And sadly, once again, the women and minorities are on the outside looking in. Making equality of opportunity a reality would not only mean keeping a promise we made to the world, it would also bring a rich diversity of perspectives, interests, and knowledge to American business that would add value to the businesses. In the last Congress, I was the first female chair of the Joint Economic Committee, a committee charged with studying matters related to employment, production, and purchasing power. The committee produced a report entitled Invest in Women, Invest in America. We found that a firm's performance correlates directly with women's representation in corporate leadership positions. In fact, Fortune 500 firms with the best record of promoting women to senior positions, including their boards of directors, are more profitable than their peers. Diversity of race and gender actually improves organizational performance and innovation. When we invest in women and minorities, we invest in our nation. But last week, as we recognized Equal Pay Day, women still faced a persistent gender gap. Women earn only 77 cents for every dollar men earn, and no progress has been made in this front for over 20 years. Tolerance for this kind of gender-based inequality doesn't just hurt women, it hurts families. In typical households, the women's paycheck accounts for over a third, 36% of the family's income. So shortchanging a woman shortchanges her children and her spouse. We need to put an end to it, and carefully crafted, fair-minded regulations can help. We should not allow this bill or any other to prevent regulations that would correct this disparity or address the other persistent obstacles to equality of opportunity. Minorities and women, if simply given a fair and even shot at success, hold phenomenal potential to drive economic growth. And at a time when we are competing in the world economy, we must have every American, minorities and women, participate to the full extent of their ability. I know some of our Republican colleagues like to talk about setting the economy right by making the hard choices, but they just don't like to acknowledge who their choices are hard on. It is inevitably the disadvantaged, the middle class, women and children, seniors and minorities who suffer from their hard choices, who bear the burden of their cuts. It is they who will suffer the most. So I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. I'm sure the gentlelady was not referring to the 4 women at the desk, but at this point I will recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Burkle, for her 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I sit here and I am in awe of some of the comments I hear from the other side of the aisle. What Americans, and I say all Americans, are struggling with is this economy and this persistent and consistent unemployment rate. The most pressing issue this nation faces is to get the American people back to work and get this economy back on track. I hear from my small businesses, my businesses in the district, we just don't know what's coming at us next. This bill will give certainty to our businesses that you can deal with the regulations on the books right now, and you don't have to be concerned about something coming down the pike that will thwart all the efforts you make to comply with the regulations you just received. The enemy of growth in this country is the uncertainty that our small businesses face day in and day out. And what we can do best for all Americans is get this economy on track. I serve on the Veteran Affairs Committee. I'm chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Health. The best thing we can do for our veterans is to make sure when they come home, they have health care, they have mental health care, physical health care, and they have a job. And this bill will ensure that we get this economy going and we give our veterans jobs. The best thing we can do for our seniors is to get this economy back on track. When more people are working, they're paying into Social Security, they're paying into Medicare, that makes it better for the seniors. And lastly, the best thing we can do for women is to get this economy back on track.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Just as soon as I finish, I'd be happy to yield. I participated in a group in Syracuse, New York, WISE, and it is Women Igniting the Entrepreneurial Spirit. 1,000 women were present there trying to get small businesses going in my district. The biggest obstacle they face is this uncertainty, how the health care is going to affect them, the regulatory environment they are forced to try to survive under. We need to give our businesses some sort of predictability, some sort of certainty that this government is going to turn around. Every time they try to do something or take an initiative, some regulation is going to stand in their way. What we need to do for all Americans, is get this economy back on track, and this bill will begin to ensure that our small businesses get what they need, some certainty. With that, I will yield to the gentlelady from New York.
Well, I would like to know exactly which section of my bill you object to. Is it pay disparity, retaliatory discharge, hostile work environments, sexual harassment, voting rights, or access to education? This is an exemption for equal protection, and it applies to equal treatment of women and minorities in these listed areas.
The gentleman reclaims her time.
Reclaim my time. Those laws and those regulations are on the books. They are on the books. We act as if all of these thousands and thousands and thousands of regulations are going to go away. Nothing is going to happen to those. We're just saying for a period of time, just for a period of time, let's give our small businesses, as the gentleman from Oklahoma said, some breathing room, some opportunity to have a thought and be able to grow it without this government, this administration, and all these regulatory agencies getting in their way and preventing them from being successful. With that, I yield back my time.
I thank the gentlelady. I have an amendment, recognize myself, I have an amendment at the desk. It's a second-degree amendment in nature of a substitute. I'll let you speak on it. Honest.
Amendment offered by Mr. Issa of California to the amendment offered by Mrs. Maloney of New York.
I recognize myself on the second-degree amendment. Although I believe that no part of the amendment offered from the gentlelady from New York is essential, I think it's essential that we make the amendment as good as possible and that we all support it, even if, as I believe, it is substantially redundant and will not be affected by this moratorium. But in the case of equal rights, I think it's critical that we have belt and suspenders, that we insist that, in fact, our actions are overly protective, if at all, from inadvertent prohibitions that might, in fact, harm our civil rights as Americans. Therefore, I offer my second-degree amendment, and the language from it is language that members who have been here longer than I will well recognize. In 1995, when a similar moratorium was being voted on in the new Republican majority, the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, offered this amendment to ensure that all individuals, not just women, but in fact people with disabilities and other protected classes, would be ensured that no such moratorium would adversely affect their civil rights. That bill, that amendment passed by a vote of 405 to 0 on a similar moratorium vote. So I'm sure the gentlelady from New York, who sits next to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, once recognizing that this was a great idea by the gentlelady from the district some decade or more ago, will support it, and I am prepared to support the underlying amendment as it will be amended.
Would the Chairman yield for a question?
I actually would recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Actually, all right.
Okay. Well, I will yield to the gentleman for a question.
Yeah, I just in the reading of this language, would this affect, for example, small business set-asides in Federal contracting? Could this affect university admission policies if they are recipients of Federal funding?
This, and it's a great question. If there is a, quote, civil rights portion to it, you're absolutely right. It would allow for those, but of course, by definition, they would have to be narrow enough to be limited to the question of, for example, equal access for people with disabilities, and that would probably be one of them that I think would be we'd be very aware of. The equal access for people with disability, which is not covered in the gentlelady from New York's, but was covered in the gentlelady from District of Columbia's words more than a decade ago, would in fact still be allowed to go forward. So although I believe that there are very few that would occur, certainly not ones over 100 million, I certainly think when it comes to civil rights and equal access, we need to make sure that we get it right. And that's the reason that I believe that expanding the gentlelady's concerns to make it include groups not considered, thus be considered. And with that, the gentleman from New York has been patiently waiting. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm still trying to find out exactly what's the objection to the lady from New York's amendment. And I also want to add that I think adding handicap and disability is very, very important. But I'm still not clear as to why someone would object to pay disparity, retaliatory discharge, hostile work environment, sexual harassment, voting rights, access to education. It's just not clear to me. I listened to the young lady from New York who indicated that she opposed it, but the point is that it's not clear to me as to why.
If the gentleman,
I'd be delighted to yield for that.
I think the gentlelady joins with me in feeling that civil rights is a broad question. It's not a question just of women. It is a question of a great many groups, and I think that's the reason that widening it to include all of the above, including every aspect of the gentlelady from New York's amendment, and using the gentlelady from the District of Columbia's own words and amendment, we believe we have something that has a history of 405 to 0 of passage in a House that includes actually all three of you, I believe, at that time. So, Ed, I think the reason is because you already voted for this amendment, so you must have liked it in 1995.
I did, but
it's just as good today.
I also like this one too.
And this one will be included in the broader bill. So I think that's the point, is we wanted something we could vote for on a bipartisan basis that included all of the spirit of Ms. Maloney's bill and our amendment, and in fact broadening it to include the words
race, religion, handicap. I like that as well. I yield now to the gentlewoman, the rest of my time to the gentlewoman from New York.
You are basically striking my amendment and replacing it with this. Is that correct?
We thought that the gentlelady would yield. Yeah, we are broadening what was a subset, but we're inclusive, as you can see, of everything that was in your amendment.
Well, it's not spelled out, pay disparity, retaliatory. I mean, why can't we do both? I like your addition of the religion, national origin, handicapped and disability status, but I like in my amendment spelling out the specific areas where women have some challenges.
If the gentlelady would yield. The fact is that the regulations would be to support those existing. Those claims already exist in the law, so those wouldn't be subject to new, but in fact regulations to protect, under all of them would be covered. So the reason to repeat something that is a claim, in fact, when we're talking regulations, it seemed to be not necessary.
Well, I would like to study this more. I would accept it if you would include my amendment and add this to that amendment, so it would be totally inclusive. But I need to make sure that the areas that I spelled out are already covered, as you so claim. Yep. I need to look exactly at where that is.
Are there any other amendments?
Pay disparity is not.
Well, pay disparity based on civil rights is. Pay disparity in general, no.
No,
like
but not with women. It isn't. With minorities, it is. Maybe in civil rights, but not with women.
It is. It's covered in the Equal Pay Act for women.
Yeah.
Well, then why is there still a 77 cents to the dollar
You
gap there?
you could ask the question. You could ask the question why the White House pays women less than men. There is a reality in the White House today that was widely reported only a few days ago. The question is, do you believe that we need to enforce the White House for some reason of discrimination?
Reclaiming my time. I would like to, we're going to be voting on this at 1 o'clock, you say, or what time do you say we're going to be voting on these?
Well, we're going to be voting on it now. If there's a recorded vote, there'll be rolled votes till that time.
Well, I certainly support the gentleman's amendment, but I support my amendment. So I would like to proceed in that way. But I do want to answer my good friend and colleague from the great state of New York with her statement about the recession and point out that when President Obama took office, this country was shedding 700,000 jobs a month. And because of his economic policies and moving forward, we have had 25 straight months of job growth where we have gained jobs in our economy. And the recession was not caused by regulations. As the President said in his State of the Union, show me a regulation that you think is burdensome and we'll work on it. He took the milk regulation, he abolished it. So what specific regulations are you objecting to, and bring them to the attention of Congress and to the administration? And I would say that some regulations save lives in terms of protecting us. We have the mad cow attack now of tainted meat. So what do? You don't put a regulation in to protect people from faulty food or food that could kill them. And I feel very strongly about equality of opportunity and equality of rights. So I accept and will support the President's, or rather the Chairman's amendment, the President of this committee, I would say. But I also would like a vote on my own amendment. And I think there's nothing wrong with speaking out loudly and clearly for women's rights, pay equity, and fighting such things as securing voting rights and fighting sexual harassment. And so I think that's an access to education. So,
if the gentlelady would yield.
Absolutely.
Speaking to the parliamentarian and trying to figure out how we might have our cake and eat it too, we have the liberty in report language to include the language and say that we believe as a committee that that is a lesser included of the language in the bill, and that nothing in our final act would preclude those items from being considered. So we believe we can both have the amendment as amended and, in fact, still have your original words in the report language, so that anyone implementing this law, should it become, or this bill should it become law, would understand that that was included. And I hope that that would meet with the gentlelady's approval.
Pardon me? Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing the report language, and we will then have a vote later at that. But accepting the gentleman's offer to include it in the report language, then I would accept it.
I thank the gentlelady.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
I'd like to yield some time to the gentlelady from New York.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Ohio. Just a couple of comments. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak in support of your amendment. I think that inclusive language is a good way to go, and it mirrors the gentlelady from the District of Columbia's language, and it's something that is really bipartisan, so I support that. I do want to comment about the gentlelady's comment regarding unemployment and the economy that this President inherited. Yes, he did inherit a very difficult economy. He then went on to spend $1 trillion towards a stimulus, and we still have unemployment at 8.2%. His policies have failed. The regulatory environment that our businesses across this nation are facing impedes their success and their growth, and impedes any opportunity for our economy to recover. So I just want to speak out in support of your amendment.
Will the gentlelady yield?
I yield back my time to the Chairman. Or I'm sorry, to Mr. Jordan, from the gentleman from Ohio.
The gentleman from Ohio controls the time. Would the gentleman yield?
Be happy to yield.
I just would like to hear from the gentlelady the specific regulations she's objecting to. I think all of us want to do away with unnecessary regulations. But if it's a regulation that protects our oil, or rather our waters from an oil spill, or a regulation that protects our air from gases going into the air. What specific regulations, not particularly right now, but could you get to us and we'll take a look at them? I think we share the concern that an unnecessary regulation should be done away with. The President said that in his State of the Union. He listed some regulations he'd abolished.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
First of all, I think in the original bill that we're talking about, there are emergency exemptions. So if, in fact, some health risk or some national security risk rears its ugly head, that will be taken care of and a regulation can be passed. So any unexpected or emergency situation is covered in this bill. So that's the first thing. The other issue is, and you mentioned with regards to pay disparity, there are rules and regulations on the book. Whether or not someone chooses to follow those rules or regulations is another issue. But what we're talking about today is just a moratorium on new regulations, except for an emergency situation or national security issue. It's all of the rhetoric. Will the gentlelady yield? Not at this time. All of the rhetoric and the hyperbole is not helpful. Many Americans, women's, veterans, seniors, are suffering because of this economy. We need to take some aggressive, bold steps to get the economy back on track. And if we don't, they will continue to suffer. So it's incumbent upon us to set aside our politics and set aside our hyperbole and get to the matter at hand, which is the economy of the United States of America, so that every American can have access to the American dream and can be successful. I yield back.
Will the gentleman from Ohio yield?
Be happy to yield, Mr. Chairman.
We will deliver to the gentlelady a list that this committee has accumulated. It's a fairly significant list. It came from our committee website. Does the gentleman yield back?
Yield back.
The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered, second-degree amendment offered by myself. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question now occurs on the amendment from the gentlelady, by the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Baloney. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment as amended by the gentlelady from New York is agreed to. Are there any further amendments? The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4078.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment I am offering is simple, straightforward, and essential. It exempts from the moratorium proposed by this bill any rule or regulation promulgated by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission related to curbing oil speculation. The CFTC is the government agency with the authority to ensure that prices Americans pay for gasoline and heating oil are fair, and that the markets in which prices are discovered operate free from fraud, abuse, and manipulation. The CFTC finalized a rule in October of last year that would limit the number of contracts trading firms can hold in certain commodities like oil. That reform would limit the ability of Wall Street firms to disproportionately affect the oil market or other commodities by using the volume of contracts held to manipulate prices in a specific direction. And the evidence is clear. In a hearing before this committee last week, Senator Coburn of Oklahoma testified that as much as $15 to $18 a gallon is added to the price of a barrel of oil as a result of Wall Street speculation. But the CFTC has delayed implementing the rule in response to lawsuits and other pressure by Wall Street groups who want the weakest rule possible. H.R. 4078 would delay indefinitely the CFTC's authority to set position limits. Today, financial speculators have overwhelmed the commodity markets and have driven out bona fide market participants who seek to reduce the risk of their investments by making offsetting investments. In fact, by some estimates, speculators account for about 70% or more of the positions taken in open contracts. Excessive speculation in oil markets has increased volatility, has increased prices in future markets, has needlessly inflated the price that all of our constituents pay at the pump. I want everyone here to listen. We are actually going to have a chance here to give the CFTC, to let them keep the tools they need to rein in the speculators. Now, if we don't do that, we are leaving our constituents wide open to speculators who are driving up the price. And when the price goes up, the oil companies make even more money off of our constituents. This bill, by the way, the larger bill, is aimed at trying to find a way to get employment back, to try to get it no higher than 6%. That's a good idea. But high oil prices are adverse to that goal. High oil prices contribute to unemployment. High oil prices slow down the economy. High oil prices break family budgets. High oil prices limit mobility. High oil prices limit commerce. So, we need to make sure the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has the tools to deal with the speculators who are driving up the price of oil. And there's plenty of evidence that would suggest that oil speculation exists, it's been excessive, and it's connected to higher prices. So this amendment is necessary, and again, it would exempt from the moratorium proposed by this bill any rule or regulation promulgated by the Commodities Futures Trading Commission related to curbing oil speculators. Let's sound a victory for American consumers by challenging these oil speculators, by making sure the Commodity Futures Trading Commission will be able to have the tools to deal with them. This is our chance. That's why this committee is important. That's why this vote on this amendment is important. So I yield back.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the Chairman, and I appreciate the passion and the intensity that my good friend, and we always use that term good friend around here, but I actually mean it. The gentleman from Ohio is a friend, and I do appreciate his concern about the high cost of oil and what it means to families and individuals across this country. But I think it's misplaced. I mean, this is a supply concern. In fact, the former CFTC Commissioner Michael Dunn, a Democrat, an Obama appointee, said this just last week, quote, "The whole time I was there at the CFTC, I never saw any empirical data that said speculators were responsible for an increase or a spike in fuel cost." In fact, I would make this point. Are there speculators in the natural gas market right now? I think there probably are. And natural gas prices are what? They're at a 10-year low. The reason they're at the 10-year low is because we have got a huge increase in supply in natural gas. So if speculators aren't driving up the cost there because we've got supply, the same thing applies to the oil market. We just don't have the supply. And frankly, this is one of the things our focus on regulation in this committee is all about, is trying to lessen some of the regulation, some of the burden this administration is placing on the ability to go increase supply in oil, so that those same constituents that my friend cares about, that we all care about, can have lower prices at the fuel pump.
Would my friend yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I just want to point out that I have a CRS report here that has a paragraph you might be interested in, and I'll read it quickly. They talk about studies from the staff of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, which found that excessive speculation has had undue influence on wheat price movements and in the natural gas market. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I would just, again, make the point. It's a supply and demand concern. We see that evidence in every other commodity. And we need this. We need an increased supply in oil if we're actually going to help with the price and help families, help small business owners, help our constituents all across this country, and frankly, help our economy. If you don't have readily available energy at affordable cost, it hurts your economy, and that's why we have got to increase supply. And the evidence, most certainly, that makes this point is in the natural gas commodity market right now.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to the ranking member.
I don't know if you were here when Senator Coburn testified.
I was not.
I don't know whether it was a subcommittee hearing or what, but he testified that as much as $15 to $18 is added to the price of a barrel of oil as a result of Wall Street speculation. I just wanted to, in support of the amendment, I think it is an appropriate amendment. I support it, but I just wanted you to be aware of that. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for Senator Coburn. I don't think he would have said it if he hadn't done the appropriate research. But I just wanted to let you know that.
Appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
I thank the gentleman from Illinois for yielding. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I want to read to you, and I ask unanimous consent, by the way, that a letter from the University of Maryland School of Law to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission regarding position limits for derivatives be put in the record.
Without objection.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. One paragraph is worth listening to. They talk about an assertion that there are no studies on position limits. The Commodity Markets Oversight Coalition, to wide fanfare, released a list of over 50 studies showing the adverse effects of speculation on energy and food prices. Now, there is the Commodity Markets Oversight Coalition is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit alliance of groups that represents commodity-dependent industries, businesses, and end users, including average American consumers that rely on functional, transparent, and competitive commodity derivatives markets as a hedging and price discovery tool. The official website of the Commodity Markets Oversight Coalition, what is the Commodity Markets Oversight Coalition, and their work is available at commoditymarketsoversight.org. And I think that it would behoove staff as well as members to look closely, again, at this issue of speculation. And we may be trying to craft a bill to get America back to work. And we both share that goal. We want to see America get back to work.
Would the gentleman yield through Mr. Davis?
I would, certainly.
Well, I would just make this point that the commodity market's impact on food prices is directly attributable to policies that begin here in Congress relative to ethanol, relative to what we've encouraged in the alternative fuels area. That's what drives that much more than any attempt to put the blame on speculators.
Well, I would say that when we're talking about speculation, we're talking about not the workings of the normal workings of the market, but an aberration in the market, a gaming of the market.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Of course.
A year ago, the administration announced a task force to deal with speculation, and it's my understanding this task force has met 4 times. Do we know of any reports, any recommendation from the President's own working group on so-called speculation?
Well, we know the President last week announced his intention for a whole new approach to deal with oil speculation. We also know—
So the working group that was announced and formed last year has not done anything?
I would assume, my friend, that the President's recommendations were the result of consultation with the working group. I would just assume that. Now, let me just say one thing in regards to that. Yesterday, I sent a letter to both the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission because they have promulgated still another rule that would actually contravene the expressed intent of the President of the United States to deal with oil speculation by essentially setting aside a whole group of energy price speculators as exempt from the rule. So this, of course, is complex, and I just want to say that whether it's this administration or some other administration, we should take the side of the American consumers in challenging the speculators. And again, the speculation is an aberration in the market. It's not the normal mechanical workings of markets.
Would the gentleman also agree that taking the side of American consumers would involve policies from our government that advocate increasing supply of those energy resources we have?
The supply relates to a broad base of choices, because supply in terms of energy relates to choices. Choices can be wind, solar, they can be oil, which they are, they can be nuclear, which I don't particularly favor.
And they can certainly be natural gas, which is at a 10-year low because supply has been increased dramatically in the last several years.
But even if you were to make the case on natural gas, I'm saying that with respect to oil, I'm focusing in on oil here, I'm saying that the oil speculation has had a dramatic effect on the commodities market and has resulted in increasing the price of oil to our constituents. I want to thank the gentleman from Illinois, and I want to thank my friend from Ohio for this exchange. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Kucinich. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed
Chairman,
to.
on that I ask a recorded vote.
Pursuant to the earlier announcement in the committee rules, this vote will be postponed. Are there any other amendments? If there are no further discussion, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. No, I can't do that yet. You can't do that now. Hold on. Yeah. We'll postpone further consideration of this bill. I now call up
4607.
Yes, thank you. H.R. 4606.
07.
The committee will now consider H.R. 4606, the Midnight Rule Relief Act of 2012, and I recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, we take up another regulatory bill aimed at preventing any outgoing president, Republican or Democrat, from imposing an influx of new regulations known as midnight regulations. During that interim period between which the lame duck office holder already is on his way out of office, it is essential that we not have bills passed or regulations created that would otherwise not have been created. Academic researchers have noted this phenomenon of imposing new regulations on the way out the door. It is an actual practice, not a hypothetical fear. I turn now to my colleague, Mr. Jordan, who has worked extensively on this, and yield the remainder of my time for his opening statement.
Well, I thank the Chairman for his work and for yielding time. The credit goes to the Chairman and to Congressman Ribble for the work on this bill. Let me just say this. It's a fact that lame duck presidents who have lost their mandate to govern rush through a glut of new regulations during the period of time after an election, but before the inauguration of a new president. This phenomenon, when a president's influence is at its greatest while his mandate by definition is at its lowest, undermines the principles of checks and balances that are enshrined in the Constitution. Accordingly, this bill, the Midnight Rule Relief Act, imposes discrete and temporary moratorium on major regulations during the lame duck period of a president's term. As all research points out, lame duck presidents have every incentive to promulgate last-minute rules and regulations to extend their influence beyond the day they leave office. The lame duck president is free from the restraints of public opinion and can issue regulations that would have been too controversial to finalize before the election. Speaker Boehner and Minority Leader McConnell have recognized the enormity of this problem. They have requested that President Obama impose a voluntary moratorium on midnight regulations, especially in light of the President's pledge to transparency, openness, and accountability. However, such a remedy is only temporary and fails to acknowledge that the issuance of controversial rules during a lame duck term is a bipartisan problem. Congressman Nadler correctly identified this problem in 2008 when he drafted the Midnight Rule Act. According to the Congressman from New York, the problem of midnight rules is not a new one, but the practice is prone to abuse and undercuts our democratic process. In his testimony before House Judiciary, he pointed out that, quote, the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution limits a president to 2 terms in office. Midnight rules can be abused to allow a president to reach into a 3rd term without any accountability. While it's too soon to predict the results of the next election, I agree with my colleague from New York that, and from the other side of the aisle, that we must now pass legislation to make sure that an outgoing president cannot, without accountability, sneak through consequential and expensive policy changes without that accountability. And with that, I would yield back to the Chairman of the committee.
Thank you. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose the Midnight Rule Relief Act of 2012. Regulations play a critical role in protecting the health and safety of the American people, and they also help ensure that our economy will function properly. To ban virtually all regulations finalized while a president is concluding his service in office would prevent our government from fulfilling its critical role. Now, by no means am I endorsing all midnight rule makings. When extensive shortcuts are taken, midnight rule making undoubtedly raises fairness concerns. I do not believe that the flurry of highly controversial rulemaking activity at the end of the Bush administration was, for the most part, advancing the public interest. But the value of a given rule should not be judged based solely on when it becomes final. A blanket moratorium on regulations that play a key role in safeguarding the American people and keeping our economy functioning makes no sense. Government must continue to work to protect our health, our safety, environmental quality, and the economy, no matter how long a president has left in his term. There should be no time when our government simply turns off the lights, but especially now as we recover from the deepest recession in modern history. A regulatory moratorium would be particularly harmful. For these reasons, I urge every member to oppose the bill. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I will hold the record open until the end of the day for any members who wish to submit written statements.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
I wish to speak to the bill.
And we'll get that opportunity in just a moment.
Thank you.
We will now open the bill, H.R. 4607, for consideration. Without objection, H.R. 4607 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is each of your folders. A clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4607, a bill to ensure economy and efficiency of Federal Government operations by establishing a moratorium on midnight rules during a President's final days in office and for other purposes.
Does any member wish to speak on the bill? The gentleman from Virginia is now recognized.
I thank the Chair. I am not unsympathetic with what might motivate this legislation because it's a fine line between exercising duly constitutional authority and abuse of that authority given the waning days of one's administration. But on the other hand, I'm troubled by the underlying logic here. If we believe in constitutional government, the President, and for that matter, members of Congress, have authority right up until their term actually constitutionally expires, whether we like it or not. Thomas Jefferson didn't like it because John Adams, his predecessor, had been rejected in the election of 1800, and yet he had a number of what were referred to as midnight appointments, especially to the Federal bench, one of whom proved to be a great nemesis of Thomas Jefferson, John Marshall, of his home state, my home state of Virginia. John Marshall went on to be a very consequential member of the Supreme Court and Chief Justice, inventing the notion that the Supreme Court arrogated to itself the right to review and nullify duly passed legislation, a new thought in constitutional history, but one that has stuck. So the logic here, why apply it only to a President? Why not apply it to members of Congress? Once any of us becomes a lame duck, does that not, by the logic underlying this bill, taint our votes? Why not extend it not only to regulations, but any legislation? Why should any president sign any bill passed after he becomes a lame duck? I would point out that under our Constitution, because of a constitutional amendment, a president, upon his reelection, automatically becomes a lame duck for the next full 4 years. Why not nullify any lame duck session of Congress? Because the voters have turned out a number of the members of Congress. So I think, we're kind of between a rock and a hard place from a constitutional point of view, and the underlying logic here takes us to a place I don't think any of us can really be comfortable with. And so while I am not unsympathetic with the motive and the concern being expressed in this legislation, I am troubled by the constitutional logic of it, and I join the ranking member in expressing my opposition to the bill.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
To who?
To the ranking member.
Okay.
I certainly yield to Mr. Cummings.
As I listen to the gentleman, you raised some issue that I was thinking about. It at some point. I mean, a president is elected for 4 years, and I think that president, whoever he or she may be, should be able to exercise the power of the president for the entire time that they are elected. And I know what the bill is trying to get at. It's trying to, what you said, it's trying to get at the abuse. The question is whether tampering with, I think, not only the rights of the president and not only the responsibilities of the president. I mean, he's still in office, so I guess he's supposed, when it comes to regulations, he's supposed to twiddle his thumbs and do nothing. Then the question becomes, does it stop at where do we, if we keep chipping away? I mean, you make a good argument about the Congress, where it may get, if you keep going down that road, you can get into Congress. But then you ask, but even before you get there, the question becomes, what other things do you take away from the president in that at the end of that 4 years? How much more do you stop saying they can't have appointments? Can they not take certain actions? Can they not declare a state of emergency? I don't know. So I think we have to be very, very careful when we're treading on that kind of territory. And I think, and I agree with you, I think I guess what we need to do is try to say the presidents be honorable and do the things that are right, so that we don't have to try to address the abuse in this way.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to submit a couple things just for the record and just to be able to speak briefly on this as well. While I fully agree, members of Congress and presidents are president for the entire time that they are elected, this particular bill is very narrow. It focuses just on one particular area, major rules, those that have an impact of $100 million or more, which has been defined out by OMB, by CBO. Everyone understands, and it's in law, what a major rule is. And it says if you're going to do a major rule, don't do it in the final moments before the transition. This is a 90-day period, basically, and if you're going to have a major rule that's imposed, it's a bad idea to cram it in at the very end and to try to get that done. Now, if a major rule has already gone through rulemaking, has already gone through process, it's going to be implemented, it can be implemented as much on January the 21st as it can on January the 19th. So that means there's been a long process in this. So this doesn't delay that. It doesn't stop that. But what it does is it prevents any president, Republican or Democrat, from getting in the final moments, saving things to the end, and then trying to cram them in after the election and to say these areas will be very controversial and I'm not sure people are going to like it, but I'm going to drop this egg into the next president's lap. and to make sure that they have to try to unwind this, or that they spend the first 6 months of their presidency trying to undo what I poked in at the very end and distract them with that. This has also been a practice that both Republicans and Democrat presidents have done, and has been a distraction, and there's been a large number of these major rules that have been dropped in at the very last moment. We're just saying to the President, if there's going to be a major rule, it needs to be planned early. There are several groups, and I'll ask unanimous consent to insert these into the records, from NFIB, from the Small Business Entrepreneurial Council, and from Mercatus on these different studies.
Without objection, so ordered.
Just to be able to get these involved. We just want to say there's a right moment to do these major rules. In the last second is not the right moment to do a major rule on the economy.
Gentlemen,
absolutely, I would.
Go ahead. Yeah, just one quick question. You know, first of all, everything you said, I agree with. You make very good points. But I guess my question is where does it end? Probably an even more an example, the thing that I think about that seems to have is even more dangerous than this is if you say, okay, you cannot create an executive order. I mean, really, that's something that's really right there. I mean, that's something that, you could just, it's like, a stroke of a pen.
Sure. Can I reclaim my time for just a moment there? I would agree, except that that's an executive responsibility, lawmaking, and what the President, obviously, we write the laws, they enforce those laws, and so the ability for them to create those regulations is something that Congress has given to the executive branch by the creation of that agency and the responsibility to fulfill this. So this is a legislative role that is uniquely there, not an executive role, like an executive order would be on that. So this is within our purview to define out to the executive branch the amount of length that they have to be able to accomplish those things, and giving them a set time period to say, you can do the major rules, just don't do them at the very last minute if they're going to impact the economy this significant.
Would the gentleman further yield?
Yes, sir. I sure would.
Mr. Connolly, I'm not a constitutional scholar, never taught it, but there are a couple of things I want to make sure that we get into the record. First of all, the word right. There is no right whatsoever to administrative rulemaking. It is, in fact, a power that belongs to this branch that we may or may not bestow on the administrative branch, the executive branch, and we choose to do it in most cases, but in fact, we have a right to limit it to 0. So, first of all, it is a power we give that we're looking at a period of exclusion. Second of all, there's a waiver authority here because we did recognize there may be exceptions, but we wanted to make sure that we made it to where clearly it would state, if he simply blanketly ignored it and used the waiver carte blanche, that it would at least leave a little asterisk after his or her name for that honorable treatment. This is a practice that has been growing by the executive branch, and the difference is that it is not an authority of the executive branch, it is an authority of Congress. And unlike an executive order, and I think the ranking member's point is extremely good, an executive order is, in fact, not something we give to the President. It's something inherent in his position, and it expires with him. Every executive order is completely open to the next President to redo, and they routinely retract a bunch, reiterate a bunch, and so on. So I think when we look at the executive powers, we're leaving those. When we look at the administrative powers that we have bestowed on the President, on a case-by-case basis, and I'll close by this. Think about this. All of us here have voted to reauthorize legislation, and all of us have known that the legislation and all its regulations expire when the underlying law expires. So if we fail to reauthorize right in the middle of a President's term, 2 years into the term, we fail to reauthorize, everything vanishes. That's the way it is because, in fact, the law in that case is temporary, and so are the regulations. So I just want us all to understand we're dealing with a power that is ours, that we bestow on the administration for good and valid reason, and we're simply saying that during that period in which we are a lame duck and he is a lame duck, we would like to have these be much rarer than they have been, and I think for that reason I'm very supportive of this legislation. I thank the gentleman for yielding. It's the gentleman.
Yield.
My time is plus 105 already at this point.
I would be happy to recognize the gentleman from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And what he's saying, he's giving you an additional minute. Yeah. Let me just say that, I understand the 90 days, and of course, which is, good. But, what happens if that occurs on the 91st day? You see, I just think that the lame duck definition is just not clear to me, because the moment you elected to your second term, you are a lame duck. I mean, there's no question about it. So, and that's the way I look at it. I mean, you can't say, because the person cannot run again, so he or she is a lame duck. Now, I'm hoping that we're not getting caught up here in emotions and that we're just looking at the Obama and making a decision based on looking at Obama. I hope that that's not a part of it. I mean, I really hope that we are now looking at it from a very sensible legislative, because let's face it, we are also lame ducks. In fact, for your information, I'm a lame duck. And right now, I'm leaving. So I'm a lame duck. So you're saying that I should not have any input in terms of what happens legislatively because I'm a lame duck?
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be delighted to yield.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like it's your time.
Okay.
No, it's your time.
My time? Okay.
Yeah, it's your time. I'm sorry. No,
As Mr. Cummings says, it's our time.
I absolutely would not say that for you as a lame duck on that one, since you're, and let me just go ahead and state publicly for the record, I would wish that you would run again, because I've enjoyed our conversations and getting a chance to get to know you. No, that does not apply, and this does not apply to the 4 years if a president is reelected, that to his whole time. This is why the bill is very specific. It's the 90 days immediately after this election. And during that time period, if they're reelected, obviously they're elected to do those things. And this applies only to major rules and that small, narrow part of it. So it's not just a broad, you're a lame duck if you're out. If it's in a major rule that's going to affect the economy, $100 million or more, shouldn't there be more planning than this to try to get it earlier rather than to try to cram it in at the very end?
Would the gentleman from New York further yield?
I'm delighted to yield to the gentleman from Virginia.
I think the gentleman makes a really good point, and in response to the chairman, who also makes a good point. I mean, I agree with him that Congress passes the laws. It expects the executive branch to carry out those laws, and that's why we have devolved rulemaking authority to the executive branch. We're not equipped to do that. And I'm not unsympathetic with the chairman's point that technically, constitutionally, those are powers that belong to the legislative branch, ultimately, as is war powers. But as the chairman knows full well, pretty much over the years, Congress has ceded those powers, I think unconstitutionally, but we've done it to the President of the United States. John Marshall was the very first Supreme Court justice, after almost 25 years of the Republic, to suddenly come up with the novel thought that the Supreme Court had the right to review and nullify duly passed laws of Congress. That was not Madison's point of view. If you read the Federalist, Madison thought ultimately you defer to the House of Representatives, the people's body, to make a judgment about the constitutionality of duly passed laws. And so I certainly understand his point of view, but what I'm trying to get at is I'm worried about where this logic takes us, though. You may like this narrowly drawn limitation on the executive, but another Congress may decide let's push it a little further. And I think that's the point the gentleman from New York is making, that and that is of concern to many of us, not about just this president, but that logic, that to deny the president the right to exercise authority in an area we've devolved to the president. What's next? Appointment powers, pronouncements, statements, signing legislation into law. Let's take away those rights too, because he might do something we don't like, or that clearly in the subsequent election the people have changed their minds. And while I understand that, I guess I think so long as I'm sworn into office for a due term, and the President likewise, I get to exercise those authorities. I was elected to do so. So was the President. And that was the point I was making. Thank you, Mr. Towns.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be delighted to yield.
Just quickly, I know the gentleman meant to say rights versus, what we provide, but I might make the point that if we are to assume that we can never take back even a small amount of that which was ours constitutionally and may have been ceded, then you'd make the case that, for example, if the Patent and Trademark Office, which we do not give rulemaking authority to, if we gave them rulemaking authority, we could never take it back. I think one of the important things about our Constitution is that from time to time we have a belief and a need that there are adjustments not in the Constitution. That has a high burden, but adjustments in those things which are inherently one body's or another and have been ceded. And I certainly think the gentleman, all of us here, recognize the Trade Promotion Authority. It has never been the President's right, but we have periodically ceded it and periodically not ceded it. And I think that's, in this case, we're talking about 70-some days of a lame duck of a President asking that at least there be a waiver declared if that President wants to do a major rulemaking and not simply have it be business as usual. And I thank the gentleman for yielding. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Oh, I'm sorry. The gentlelady from California, my colleague, Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would just like to speak on the bill.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I actually think there's much merit in this measure, but in some respects I don't think it goes far enough. I think the American people are pretty disgusted by the pardoning authority that is exercised by presidents and governors as they are leaving office, and the appointments by presidents and executives during a lame duck period when they put people in positions at the end of their administration. So I actually think we're on to something, but I think it needs to be crafted in a way that includes some of the other conduct that I think is objectionable as well. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? Seeing none, if there is no further discussion, I move the Committee on Government Oversight and Government Reform report the bill H.R. 4607 to the House with the recommendation it do pass. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. The committee will now consider H.R. 3609, the Taxpayers' Right to Know Act, and I recognize myself for a quick opening statement. The Oversight Committee has two fundamental principles, and first, the taxpayers have a right to know how we spend their money, and we address both of these with this bill. First, Americans have a right to know that money Washington takes from them is well spent. Second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. The Taxpayers Have a Right to Know Act will not only strengthen government's accountability and transparency, it will create a government that is more streamlined, efficient, and cost-effective. In 2010, Senator Colburn proposed an amendment to the debt limit vote requiring GAO to examine duplication in government programs and issue recommendations to resolve them. GAO has since issued 2 reports on government duplication, finding 81 areas of duplication and cost savings in 2011 and 51 additional in 2012. The committee has held hearings and examined GAO's report, which found the duplication was responsible for numerous examples of waste and misspending, as well as general lack of accountability. The Taxpayers' Right to Know Act would continue the important work of the GAO began 2 years ago. GAO's work is important, but but the executive branch itself is also in a unique position to evaluate and address program duplication and waste. The Taxpayers' Right to Know Act would require agencies to identify all the programs and review them for cases of duplication and overlap. Agency officials are in a unique position to identify duplication among programs they administer. Federal civil servants are administering these programs literally every day in an intimate, on-the-ground manner. The Act would also task each agency with determining the overhead cost attributed to each of these programs and issuing recommendations to consolidate duplicative programs and terminate those programs that are unnecessary or have become outdated. Agency findings would be posted online. This would potentially lead to billions of dollars in annual savings. Reducing duplicative programs is not only an important and necessary part of creating a more efficient government, it is arguably the most important element. Reducing duplication creates immediate benefits by reducing program costs and administrative overhead. The Taxpayers' Right to Know Act would strengthen transparency and accountability and help create a government that is more efficient and effective. We need a culture of change in Washington, and this Act is an important step toward achieving that goal. I might add, the President has spoken at State of the Unions. The President has spoken repeatedly about this. This is an effort not of one party or another, not of one branch or another, but an effort that we all share in. With that, I recognize the gentleman from Maryland for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I believe this bill is well-intentioned. We all believe that government should be more transparent, so I do not intend to oppose the bill. However, I am concerned that this bill does not accomplish the goals it is intended to, and instead will place an unnecessary burden on agencies. The bill requires agencies to report a significant amount of information. This will require substantial agency resources. And some of the information agencies must report under the bill is already required by other laws. For example, the bill requires agencies to report information on improper payments made by the agency. The Improper Payments Information Act of 2002 already requires agencies to report information on their improper payments. Additionally, the bill requires duplicative reporting of performance information required by the GPRA Modernization Act that was just enacted last year. Some of the requirements are also unclear. The bill requires every agency to estimate the number of clients served by every program administered by the agency. However, the bill does not define the term client, so the meaning is unclear. For example, would the Environmental Protection Agency count the number of people who breathe oxygen as clients of a Clean Air Act program? I would like to note a positive provision in the bill, and that is the requirement that agencies report the number of full-time positions that are paid through a grant or contract. Information about contract employees is often difficult to obtain, and this requirement will improve the oversight and accountability of Federal contracts. I know that the Chairman plans to offer an amendment which makes improvements by eliminating some of the duplicative requirements that are in the bill. I will address the amendment at the time it is offered. I hope the Chairman will continue to work on streamlining this legislation so that it can improve transparency without compromising efficiency. That I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
I thank the Chair. I thank the Ranking Member. I completely share his concerns. I don't know that this is a bill worth opposing, but I am concerned that there are a number of duplicative and overlapping and maybe even conflicting or ambiguous provisions, and I specifically cite 2A1, 2A2A, 2A2B, 2A3, 2C, 2C4, 2C5, C, 2D3, among others. I asked CRS, Congressional Research Service, to look at this issue of duplication, overlapping provisions, or possible conflicts with legislation, of course, passed by the Congress, the Government Performance Results Act. And so I look forward to seeing the Chairman's amendment, and I also look forward to maybe between now and when we get to the floor, just trying to make sure that we're not inconsistent or we're not duplicating or adding additional unnecessary layers of reporting already properly addressed by the Congress through GPRA. And so that is my concern as well, and I associate myself with the remarks of the distinguished Ranking Member, and I yield back to him.
I thank both of the gentlemen, and certainly we will ensure that there is no duplication in our deduplication bill. We will hold the record open until the end of the day so all members may submit written statements. We will now open the bill, H.R. 3609, for consideration. Without objection, H.R. 3609 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed to each of you and is in your folders. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 3609, a bill to provide taxpayers with an annual report disclosing the cost of, performance by, and areas for improvements for government programs and for other purposes.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of substitute the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3609, offered by Mr. Langford.
The amendment has been distributed, and without objection, the amendment will be considered read and original text for purposes of amendment. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, the Chairman of the Subcommittee on Technology and Information Policy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last thing we would want to have is a duplication bill that has duplication in it. What this does is this simplifies the process. Many different agencies have their own unique system, but it is impossible to be able to go through all of those and be able to determine. The simple question of going to an agency and saying, can you give us a list of all the programs, their cost, the number of staff that are involved, the contracts, grants, just the details, the metrics of how you evaluate it. Most agencies cannot do that. If you cannot do that, you cannot evaluate whether there is duplication in programs from one agency to the next. This bill simply tries to get out into the public arena and into a spot where even Congress can take a look at each agency and to be able to determine from the information from the agencies, can we compare one program to another program. Taxpayers' Right to Know Act provides information on government programs, spending, and duplication. But it's information only. Then it comes back to us, and we make the decision on what to do with it from there. It establishes those reporting requirements for agencies to better identify those inefficiencies. It has to have each agency identify the programs it oversees, provide the information on it, the cost on it, and the resources that are dedicated to it. It also asks for the evaluation that those programs have, and so that we'll know the metrics that they are using as well. It's combining this information into one place so we can compare it one to another. So with that, I look forward to the conversation about this. This should be a very bipartisan bill. As I had mentioned to a couple of my Democrat friends, I really believe this is a bill that a Democrat would bring up if a Republican was in the White House, just like a Republican would bring up if a Democrat's in the White House, because it is information only, so then we as Congress can then act on it. With that, I yield back.
I recognize the former chairman of the full committee, who was never a lame duck with me, Mr. Towns.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me say that to the gentleman from Oklahoma. You know, I thank you for what you're trying to do. And but I feel that this legislation does not get us there. I oppose the bill on that basis. The Taxpayers' Right to Know Act. The bill is a charade. It masquerades as one which promotes transparency in government, but it simply does not do that. All it does is burden already strapped federal agencies with duplicative and unnecessary reporting requirements without giving them the resources to meet the new burden. This is truly an unfunded mandate. Agencies may never have the chance to meet the onerous requirements with some of these bills being discussed today. We are ensuring that the federal government will not be able to attract and retain the best and brightest public servants who will ultimately be responsible for getting this work done if we have nobody sitting at computer desk. And we don't want to pay the computer desk to begin with. This bill needs some additional work. I want to let you know that I'm willing to work with you on it. I think I have a good feel in terms of where you want to go. But I think that we have to be careful, because some of the things that we are asking them to do is going to require additional resources to be able to get them to do it and to be able to do it properly. And I think that what we really want them to do is to do it accurately and properly, to be able to get this information to see in terms of how we might be able to save. I'm saying that based on what I'm reading here, that it's going to require additional resources. And that is not the way we want to go in this day and age. I want to work with you, to see what we can do to strengthen it before sending it to the House. I can't support this, but I do feel that you're onto something, but this is not quite it.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be delighted to yield.
If your office contacted an agency and said, we just want to know, tell me as your agency what programs you have as an agency, how much they cost, and how many staff are dedicated, do you think that's something they should be able to tell you?
Yeah, but I think there's also something else. we might need to be able to do some things before. You know, I don't know in terms of all the problems that they might have. You know, let me just say this to you. You know, we've been dealing with IRS, and it's amazing how these computer systems don't even work. I mean, they don't, there's no way they can communicate. And of course, we can't ask them to do certain things until we give them the new computers and to make them compatible. So I'm saying that we need to look to see where we are first before we leap. That's all I'm saying. I think you're right. I think the request that you're making is in order. But I also recognize that they might not be in a position to do it unless we do some things. So what I'm saying that this might be an unfunded mandate, and that's a problem. I'll be delighted to yield.
I want to associate myself with the comments of Mr. Towns. I support the bill. I think it's I think it's well intentioned, but I think still there's a lot of duplication. And I think the person who made me more sensitive to this than anybody else is Mr. Connolly. We were working on another bill, and he was pointing out to me how that bill would have put an extra burden on universities to report certain things, and we were able to work that out with the chairman the other day. But I think we got to be very careful with duplication, and I know Mr. Towns means it when he says if there's some kind of way we can work together to just kind of streamline it. I don't think there's a problem with the intention. I think that in these budgetary times when we're looking for every dime we can find, I think we need to try to just be kind of careful that we're not duplicating. I know, and this is an improvement. The amendments improve it, but I think there's probably a lot more that can be done. And with that, I'll go back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. But let me just again offer to work with you on trying to strengthen it and help you to go where I think you really want to go. And I'm not saying that your idea, your suggestion is wrong. I'm just saying that this particular bill is not quite cooked. That's all I'm saying. It needs some more bacon.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Consistent with what I think with Mr. Langford is trying to do, which I greatly applaud and support. On the previous administration, there was a website. It was expectmore.gov. Expectmore.gov was there and intended to create a dashboard indicators for programs and initiatives by the Federal Government. The Obama administration has discontinued this, and I think that is unfortunate. If you go to expectmore.gov right now, it says, expectmore.gov was an initiative by the George W. Bush administration. This website has been archived and is posted here as a historical resource. It has not been updated since the end of 2008, and links to the many external websites and some internal pages will not work. I hear a chorus of people saying we want to have more exposure. The American people, I think, deserve to see the very basic information about programs and things that they're paying for. And this was something that was in place. There was a website. It was, we're not saying it was perfect, but it was moving in the right direction, and then it was discontinued. And so we're concerned about duplication and those other things. If we want transparency, I think this initiative was good because it pointed out not only things that were just working, but things that weren't working. By their own metrics, they were required to set up metrics, and then they were measured by those metrics. And they were given scorecards. And it was something that as a citizen, when I was a candidate, I looked at this to try to find out which programs were working and which weren't working. And I expect more from our government, and I think we should reinstitute one of these, a similar type of effort, and I think that's what Mr. Langford is trying to do as well. I would encourage people to look at this website. I think we as a committee should look at this and see if this is something that we should not push the administration to continue for. I will yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma. Yes.
I associate myself with those comments as well, but the reality of what I'm trying to accomplish with this is asking information that's basic information that every agency should be expected to do already. If agencies can't tell us what programs that they have, how many people that they have, the metrics of how they're evaluating that program, and a basic description of that program, these are things they should already have. And if they don't, there should be an expectation to them to say, we expect good performance of every agency, to include also good supervision. We have all railed on the Department of Defense because they are incapable of auditing themselves. They have no idea how many contractors and subcontractors they have, and they're working through that process. But at this point, we should be able to go to all the other agencies, and so far my understanding is the only agency that can fulfill this today, right now, that can turn it on, is Department of Education. They can actually list out every program, all their metrics, all their process, that they're actually fulfilling this. Others may have many of these things, but don't have all of them. But we want to be able to encourage our agencies, basic governance, basic management. You've got to be able to tell what these things are and allow each group, including us, to be able to look in agency to agency. We know there are however many programs for these different things. We don't really know the details of it because the agencies can't tell us. So all of this tries to do is to say the information that you have should be compiled together, and what you have and we expect you to do as a part of good management, we know where it is and it's in consistent format. With that, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yield to the Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Most of us, virtually all of us, sit and read through and listen to the President at State of the Union, and we leave and we talk to our local press, and then we go on with our lives. And it isn't until a moment like this that I sit in the chair and I suddenly go, wait a second here. The President in the State of the Union told us about two types of fish, saltwater and freshwater regulation of the same fish, and started talking. Ms. Spear, I know, is smiling for a reason. He started talking about duplication, and he told us he was instructing all of his Cabinet to scrub for duplications, for waste. So I think that although this may be redundant in that the President may have already done it, it really only is saying to these agencies, do what the President said he wanted you to do in his State of the Union, and let us know what you've already done. If you haven't done it, do it. And if you have done it, tell us what you've done. And I know we've had a lot of controversial, difficult work today, but this should be one that I think we're in total agreement with the President, what we heard in the State of the Union. I know that some people may want to make technical changes or even some further refinements when this goes to the floor. And I would pledge to members on both sides, if we can make it more consistent, less burdensome, but stay with the spirit of what the President told us in the State of the Union, I plan on making sure that's the way it is when it comes to the floor. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask unanimous consent for an additional minute so I could just finish?
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. The GSA, and with that scandal, came and testified. Martha Johnson, the former administrator at the GSA, came, and she was touting as one of the few examples of what the GSA has done, and their good work, is results.gov. Go type in results.gov right now into your computer, and you'll see that there's nothing pops up. These are things that, you know, the server can't be found, and these were things that were in place and should be handed as a baton from one administration to another. It's not, shouldn't be a Republican side or Democratic side. It's just good government exposure, openness, and transparency, and I would hope we would support that. But unfortunately, these initiatives, in part, were there and have been taken down. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I support this bill. I thank the sponsor for its introduction. I agree with you that this is something we can do on a bipartisan basis. You know, I've been here 3 years now since I took what's his name's place. I'm just glad he found another job.
You know, it's so easy for us to forget these guys.
A very familiar face. He'll come to me. But
go home and see the mayor. It could come to you.
So I want to thank him for doing this, and I do want to stress, I don't think this is as onerous as some folks might suggest. A lot of this information exists. It clearly exists within the bill, and a lot of this would just be recalculating the percentages, and I recognize that the White House currently does this. So, Mr. Chairman, procedurally, would this be a time to offer a friendly amendment to the substitute?
I could think of no better time.
Very good. There is an amendment at the desk then.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3609, offered by Mr. Quigley of Illinois.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment I'm offering is a natural extension of what H.R. 3609 is trying to do. It would require agencies to include a taxpayer receipt on each agency website. A taxpayer would be able to enter how much he or she paid in taxes on a given year. Then the calculator would show how much the taxpayer contributed to each program administered by that agency. This calculator would use information already required under this Act. The calculation is extremely simple. The White House website already does it for higher-level budget categories. This amendment is in the spirit of transparency and accountability. When you buy groceries, you get a receipt showing how much each item costs. But when it comes to large purchases the typical consumer makes each year, sending a check to the IRS, there is no detailed record of this transaction. Taxpayers deserve accurate information about how their tax dollars are being spent. You get more information when you pay your property tax bills in Cook County. You actually get a pie chart that does this, a much smaller government. Taxpayers deserve accurate information on how their dollars are being spent. This receipt will help Americans hold their elected officials accountable for spending in Washington. It will also go a long way towards restoring the trust deficit. A CNN ORC poll from September 11th revealed that only 15% of Americans trust the Federal Government to do what is right. I hope that providing taxpayers with clear information about how their tax dollars are being spent, we can begin to restore that trust. So to me, this isn't all that complicated, but it's also good policy. It's that marriage of policy and government. Polls show that the majority of Americans dramatically overestimate how much we spend, for example, on foreign aid. I think that skews their electoral decisions sometimes. I think it skews how they view this and react to the lawmakers. If they would go on a website and finally find out how much it actually breaks down, it could dramatically impact how they view what we're doing here in D.C. and make it easier, quite frankly, to do our job. So on that, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I think Mr. Lankford will have more to say on it, but would you want this to include, let's say on a $10,000 tax bill, that $4,000 was borrowed from the Chinese? I mean, you know, because if we look at the agency's spending, we should also explain to them how much we're borrowing, and I think that would horrify the taxpayer, wouldn't it?
No, I understand the point, but I don't think it's the intention of this amendment. And it's not that it's not a bad idea for people to know how much of their money overall is being spent on debt service, and I appreciate that point. But this is a little bit more of understanding in the sense that it's the difference between the grocery bill and their overall family budget. So I would support something like that if it was part of the larger bill. This is just taking the information that Mr. Lankford's bill requires agencies to have and put it in a very workable form so the public can understand how their tax dollars are being spent within that agency.
The gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thanks. And I do appreciate the conversation about it on that. And this is one of these times I look at the numbers on it, and I think this is another great reason for the DATA Act, actually, and what is currently moving through on the House right now, because it would allow everyone to be able to reach into all these different areas and to have consistent data that you can pull from, that you can actually manage. So we currently have a bill working through the House right now on a bipartisan basis that allows us to do this. But it doesn't just allow us to do this. It allows every watchdog group to do this. Many of us have debt clocks or have seen the debt clocks on all these different websites out there that track it. They're pulling Treasury information and they're running that, but it's not the Federal Government that does that. It is an outside group that's actually pulling that and that is doing that and that is paying for that. So while I agree, because I have the same thing on my tax bill, when I get from any kind of county property taxes, it details exactly how much is going to libraries and our great career tech system and all the different, it details out exactly on that. When you're dealing with thousands upon thousands of programs, that is a different animal to be able to track through on that. It's also the question the Chairman asked about how much would it show how much it borrows. The question would be as well for the 47% of Americans that don't pay income tax, could they punch in their income and show how many things they get for free in the same listing and get a chance to break it out, and do you see free, 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 free all the way across it, or knowing that somebody down the street, you punch in theirs and show how much they paid for it and you got it for free. I mean, there's all the options that are there with it, how it would break it out. I'm very open to that, and I think that's coming. If we have the DATA Act pass and we have this pass, I think there will be lots of watchdog groups that will do this exact same thing, and we won't have to ask our Federal agencies to do it, to plug it in, because I do think that will occur, and it will happen with these outside watchdog groups, and I think each group will do it different. And your comment about foreign aid is absolutely correct. The people back home think that we spend half our budget on foreign aid, and they have no idea what a very small percentage it is of how we're engaged internationally in foreign aid. That is telling to be able to see, and I agree that it's telling to be able to see from your own tax bill to see what that amount would be. But I think that's not something we're going to have to ask people to do. I think that's going to rise up organically and will happen through all kinds of watchdog groups all over the country once they can actually get to the data and manage it.
Thank the gentleman. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered. Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the amendment.
You have an amendment to Mr. Quigley's amendment?
No, actually, no, the amendment to the substitute.
Yeah, that would be the next amendment.
I'm sorry.
No problem. If no further seeking recognition, the question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Quigley. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentlelady.
We have a recorded vote when the time is appropriate on that, Mr.
It is requested and will be postponed pursuant to committee rules. We now go to the gentlelady from California for purposes of offering an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's an amendment at the desk, I believe.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3609, offered by Ms. Spear of California.
The gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very simple amendment, but it speaks volumes, I think, to the American people. As we all know, there are sole source contracts that are made each year in the Federal Government. In fact, of the $535 billion that are awarded to contractors in the year 2010, over one-third of them were sole source contracts, $177 billion. This particular amendment would require that sole source contracts above $150,000 would have to be disclosed, along with the amount of the non-competitively awarded contracts and the justification for these contracts. It would require them to report on the number of follow-on contracts awarded when the justification for the original contract was unusual and compelling urgency. Let me point out that very recently, an Alaska Native Corporation firm received widespread media attention when an executive and 3 others were charged in an elaborate bribery kickback scheme that steered $780 million in a DoD contract to the ANC firm. The U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia called it, quote, one of the most brazen corruption schemes in the history of Federal contracting. Mr. Chairman, there has been a lot written about sole source contracting in the Federal Government. We have never gotten a handle on it. This particular amendment, I believe, will create that transparency and give us the opportunity to hold everyone accountable. Reports by agency inspector generals, the Government Accounting Office, and other independent reviewing bodies have shown that non-competitive contracts have been misused, resulting in wasted taxpayer resources, poor contractor performance, and inadequate accountability for results. So this amendment would help this committee, the GAO, and the public ascertain the full picture of non-competitive contracting activities, and I would request the support of this measure.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I will.
I fully concur that this committee has an obligation broadly. DoD did some work, but we have an obligation broadly to deal with the growth and continuation of sole source, unwarranted sole source, including the reporting language, or reporting of it. Since we have passed out of the House the DATA Act in the last couple of days, I think, assuming the Senate takes it up, we're going to have some new tools. I might suggest that the gentlelady withdraw her amendment at this time and that we work together on a bipartisan standalone requirement that we could still in this Congress have hearings on and I believe be able to move as a standalone.
Mr. Chairman, with that commitment to hold hearings and do a standalone bill, I would be happy to withdraw the amendment.
The gentlelady withdraws. Are there any other amendments?
I have an amendment, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the gentleman's amendment. Mr. Cummings.
Amendment offered by Representative Cummings to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3609.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, the substitute amendment defines agency to include offices in the legislative branch other than the Government Accountability Office. My amendment limits the definition of agency to the executive branch. It is unclear which legislative branch offices would be covered by the bill. It seems likely that this would include the Congressional Budget Office, but it also could include offices within the Library of Congress, the Office of Legislative Counsel, and the Parliamentarian. This just doesn't make sense. These offices have limited resources, and requiring the extensive reporting required by this bill would be very burdensome without a clear benefit. The purpose of this bill, I think, seems to be aimed at increasing transparency of the resources and activities of the executive branch agency programs. There is no need to include the legislative branch, which is outside the jurisdiction of this committee. Additionally, including the legislative branch in the bill raises a constitutional issue. The bill requires the Office of Management and Budget to issue regulations implementing the bill. Requiring the legislative branch to comply with OMB regulations could be a violation of separation of powers. I urge the committee to clarify this issue by adopting my amendment, and I thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you. And I do understand that as we went through the language of this in page 6 on the A&S, when it talks through the United States Code, except the term that also includes offices in the legislative branch, we wanted to make sure that we're not passing a law that Congress is exempt from. That was our concern, is that if we're putting this out there, the last thing we want to do is have yet another something that is out there to say Congress exempts itself, assuming that we're completely efficient. The limited reporting requirements, I believe the legislative branch already fulfills with just the basics of it. We know because we don't have as many programs in different agencies. It would be fairly simple for us to be able to be included in that. I would agree that we do not want OMB overseeing the legislative branch and giving us instructions. I think there's something that we could fulfill in the reporting of it, and to be able to make that clear in the actual report when it comes out, and that may be something we can work out in the final language when it comes to the bill. And so I'm sympathetic to what you're saying, but I don't want Congress to be exempt from our own laws.
I agree, and I just want to be, I wanted to be very clear, and so I will withdraw and work with the gentleman.
Be great. All right. Thank you.
I thank both of you. The gentleman withdraws. Are there any further amendments? We now would postpone further consideration of this bill until we reconvene for all the rolled votes. And we now go to the last piece of legislation. The committee now will consider, oh, wait a second. I'm sorry, we have two. Yep. Yes. Okay. The committee will now consider Senate 1302 to authorize the Administrator of the General Services to convey a parcel of real property in Tracy, California, to the City of Tracy. It is my I would now ask, or I guess does the clerk need to report it? Would the clerk report the bill?
S. 1302, an act to authorize the Administrator of General Services to convey a parcel of real property in Tracy, California, to the City of Tracy.
It is my intention to consider this bill by unanimous consent. Does any member object to unanimous consent on this bill? I now ask unanimous consent. You considered favorably report S. 1302. Without objection, so ordered. The committee stands in recess until 15 minutes after the commencement of the last vote. So following the vote, we'll expect everyone to come back, and we will convene for all rolled votes. We stand in recess.